Hey guys, today we step out onto a snowy prairie where the wind tugs at your hood and you're already questioning your life choices. The ground crunches beneath your boots, each step sounding like biting into stale crackers. You glance up and see the outlines of tall slanted poles leaning together like skeletal ribs against the winter dusk. These aren't random sticks jammed into the ground. They are the bones of a tipi, the kind of winter shelter that against all odds managed to keep people warm through blizzards that would make your modern thermostat cry for mercy. And yes, spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this without some help. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That way you won't miss the next time we figure out how to stay alive in places where even penguins would file complaints. And hey, leave a comment with your location and local time. I want to know whether you're listening in a snowy midnight cabin in Montana or lying on a beach in Florida wondering why on earth you're hearing about frozen bison hides. Now let's imagine it's the 18th century. The northern plains are locked in ice, the horizon is white, and the only thing louder than the wind is the silence it leaves in your ears after it dies down. You trudge toward the tipi circle of a Lakota camp, smoke rising from slits at the top like sleepy eyelids blinking open. Inside those hide walls lies warmth, imperfect warmth, smoky warmth, but warmth nonetheless. The tipi was more than just a house. It was a marvel of portable engineering designed by trial, error, and centuries of learning how to live in climates where the weather isn't unpleasant. It's actively trying to delete you. Picture 20 or so long lodge poles, each about 15-20 feet tall, gathered into a cone and lashed at the top. This skeleton could be raised or taken down in less than an hour. The poles were then wrapped in massive sheets of tanned buffalo hides, sometimes a dozen or more stitched together and stretched taut, so that the tipi looked smooth and slightly glossy in the snowlight. Here's the mainstream fact: tipis were far better insulated than most people today imagine. While log cabins built by settlers might trap drafts through their walls, the tipi could flex and shift with the wind sealing itself more tightly. In fact, some accounts describe settlers being astonished by just how warm the interior of a well-managed tipi felt on a sub-zero night. And here's the quirky tidbit: sometimes snow itself became part of the insulation. Families would pack snow around the base of the tipi to seal off drafts, much like you might shove a towel under your apartment door when your roommate is cooking fish at 2 a.m. It sounds counterintuitive, snow as insulation, but in fact snow holds heat because it traps pockets of air. Imagine falling asleep knowing that what's keeping you alive is a crust of the very thing trying to kill you. Of course, historians still debate the exact thermal efficiency of the tipi compared to later frontier housing. Some researchers argue that the tipi's smoke venting system lost too much heat, while others point out that a balance had to be struck. If you closed the flaps too tightly, you might wake up warm but coughing from smoke inhalation. It was less perfect insulation, and more an ongoing experiment in not suffocating. Step inside with me for a moment. The first thing you notice isn't the heat, it's the smell. There's the smoky tang of the central fire mixed with the faint musk of hides, and the earthy sweetness of dried sage. The ground underfoot is padded with mats woven from reeds or grasses because nobody wanted to sleep directly on frozen soil. Over those mats are buffalo robes heavy enough to feel like gravity just doubled. And against the curved walls, bedding is arranged layered with furs, blankets, and anything else that could help trap warmth. You sit down, draw your knees up, and listen to the wind push against the hide walls. It sounds like waves of an invisible ocean, but inside it's calmer, the firelight flickering gold across the poles above. Someone adjusts the smoke flaps and a draft of cold air slips in like the night, reminding you it's still out there waiting. And here's where the gentle sarcasm comes in. If you're thinking this sounds rustic but cozy, remember, this isn't glamping. This is surviving blizzards without fleece jackets, Gore-Tex boots, or heated blankets from Amazon. This is waking up every few hours to stoke the fire because otherwise your water jug will be an ice block by morning. It's like working the graveyard shift, literally, if you don't keep that fire alive. Still, the tipi worked. It wasn't about eliminating cold. It was about managing it. About finding that balance between fire-hide snow and human bodies. And it did something else as well. It created community. Families gathered close around the fire, sharing stories, warmth, and sometimes grumbles about whose turn it was to tend the smoke flaps. But what about when the storm really began to rage, when the wind howled like 1,000 flutes and snow piled so high you couldn't see out? That's when the tipi revealed its next secret. You trudge a little closer, and the wind hushes just enough for you to hear it. The faint creak of wood, the dry whisper of bark being shaved, and somewhere out by the tethered horses, a soft bell tinkling like a sleepy heartbeat. Before hides ever meet wind, you learn there's the tipi skeleton, the poles tall and spare rising like a rib cage made of trees. You reach out and lay a glove to one cold, smooth, resin-scented, and feel the memory of the forest still in it. You start where the builders start with the trees themselves. On these plains, people travelled to the right groves at the right seasons, seeking slender trunks that grew arrow-straight. Lodgepole pine was a favourite light, strong and willing to grow, without the rebellious curves that make tents sulk, but other straight conifers, or hardwood served where pine was scarce. You watch a pole being evaluated the old-fashioned way, sighted down the length like a musician checking a flute. A slight warp means a future wobble. A knot in the wrong place means an awkward lash point that will squeak all night an unwanted duet with that horse bell. Here's the mainstream fact. The typical winter-ready tipi stood on a careful frame of perhaps a dozen to 20 poles, with a tripod or quadrupod foundation at its heart. The first 3 or 4 poles made the stable core. Then the rest spiralled into place, leaning together at the crown where the smoke would later escape. The geometry wasn't random. It was learned, practiced and taught not just as mechanics, but as a rhythm, like a set list your hands know by muscle memory. The poles you're eyeing now have their bark trimmed thin. Greenwood shrinks when it dries, so poles were often seasoned, reused over years and touched up as needed. A child runs a hand down one and grins when the palm comes away sticky. You grin too, because nothing says authentic winter like cold sap in your mittens. Strips of rawhide, braided sinew, or later traded cordage will lash these poles together. You catch the maker's motions: wrap, pull, tuck, wrap, pull, tuck. The knot sits like a well-tied scarf, humble, secure, and the difference between shelter and snow sculpture. Distant bells ring again, just 1 or 2 soft notes while the tripod goes up. In one sweep, the 3 core poles lift, pivot, and bite into the ground, as if the prairie itself is helping. You add the next pole and the next, each angled with intention, so the cone will be even, so stress will distribute like a quiet conversation rather than a brawl. A long lifting pole acts as a lever and a helper, something like a backstage crew for the big reveal. Before you know it, you're standing inside a ring of leaning trunks, looking up into a cone of pale wood that frames the sky like the iris of an enormous eye. Here's the quirky tidbit. Among some families, a few favourite poles had nicknames and expected jobs: the relaxed cousin who always takes the same seat at dinner. One pole might be the faithful door friend, another, the dependable smoke watcher. Give a pole a roll, and it gets remembered, placed and respected. Also, it's easier to tease your brother for misplacing the good one. And yes, some people swore the poles talked in storms, a chorus of tiny clicks and groans that forecast whether the night would be a lullaby or a drummer's solo. You notice practical refinements too. The lower ends of poles are beveled so they settle cleanly into soil or packed snow. The upper ends, where all the pressure converges, are slightly abraded for grip, kept free of icy glaze with a quick scrape. Each pole becomes a line in an unseen equation. Each angle democratically shares the work with every other. Like a well-run night shift, nobody gets to nap while the others freeze, tempting sure but frowned upon by both physics and family. Historians naturally still argue about the finer points. Did the spread of horses change optimum pole counts and lengths, making larger shelters more practical to transport as travel loads got easier? Were 3-pole foundations a hallmark of certain nations and 4-pole starts of others, or did families mix and match based on materials, wind and experience preference? You hear the debate in the language of people who've spent a lot of time in cold libraries. Some say this, others counter that, and like snow the truth may drift in layers. You move around the growing framework and the prairie crunches underfoot like sugar. The motif of tiny bells follows you, an occasional ring, when a horse tosses its head, a private metronome for the work. Poles lift and settle in a rhythm you can almost hum. Someone jokes that the worst part of winter is not the cold, but when a pole slips down your sleeve. You laugh because that's ridiculous, then realise it's only slightly ridiculous. You learn quickly, keep your sleeves tight, your grip steady and your hat on, because wind loves souvenirs. A few elders check spacing with a glance. A young builder checks with a cord. Measuring by rope or by eye, the result is the same, an elegant cone whose footprint matches the household's needs. Too small, and you'll spend the season elbowing your cousin and pretending you like it. Too big, and you're heating the neighbourhood instead of your bedding. Balance always balance, just enough pole, just enough space, just enough breath left over to sing. There's a quiet comedy to the process. You tell yourself you're helping, but mostly you're trying not to stand exactly where the next pole wants to go. You step left, the pole steps left, you step right. It follows like a loyal but misguided dog. Finally, someone gently pivots you and the pole slides past into place with a sigh, as if it thinks you've been adequately supervised. Apprentices and aunt murmurs smiling. You pretend not to be an apprentice. The bell out by the horses disagrees. Angles set, tops nested, the crown opens like a mouth waiting for a story and later for smoke. The lower circle invites the next act, a cover that will catch wind, deflect snow and keep warmth inside. But even before hides arrive, you can feel the shelter's promise. The frame itself makes a different kind of silence, a pocket where the gale is muffled. You test it by standing just outside and then stepping back in. Outside, the wind pushes your coat. Inside, it mostly combs your hair. Call it the difference between a shove and a nudge. There's more cleverness in the details. A lifting line or lashing cord is kept ready at the crown so the cover can be hoisted smoothly. A doorway gap is planned now, not improvised later, aligned away from the most punishing gusts. You check the ground ring and notice a slight slope chosen for drainage. Meltwater will prefer the outside path, not a tour through your bedding. Little decisions add up to big comfort, the way making your bed doesn't warm the room, but somehow warms the evening. You pause and let your senses stack resin in the air, the rasp of a knife shaping a tip, the bell's periodic punctuation, the grainy feel of frost dusting your scarf. The poles give the tipi height for smoke to rise and loft for warmer air to collect above your heads, while the lower circle where you'll sit and sleep benefits from the way the cone funnels and smooths the draft. It's subtle aerodynamics conducted by people who would simply say, this is how you keep the wind polite. And when the storm hits the poles will flex without failing, bending like reeds, and then settling back time after time, night after night. That living flexibility is the difference between a shelter that endures and a box that buckles. You consider the modern tent you once tried to pitch in a parking lot. The parking lot won. The crown is ready. A lashing knot gets one more tug, and the structure gives a contented hush, the sound a well-tuned drum makes before the first beat. The horses snort. The bell answers. Someone hands you the long lifting pole and points toward a bundle of tanned hides, soft as heavy snow and strong as a promise. The skeleton stands quietly asking for its skin. You take a breath that tastes like pine and frost. Time to dress the frame to turn angled wood and winter light into a weatherproof hush. The hides are waiting, stitched, painted, and heavier than they look, and the first edge is already in your hands. But the way those hides meet the wind and the little trick that keeps snow from sneaking in at the base that comes next. You stand back now watching the skeleton of poles lean together like ribs, and it strikes you how naked they seem against the snow. A tipi without its skin is all promise, no payoff, like owning a bed frame with no mattress. What comes next is what transforms it from a clever pile of sticks into a warm refuge. The hides stretched tight, stitched together and heaved into place with muscles that, frankly, you wish you had spent more time at the gym preparing. You reach for one, and the first thing you notice isn't the weight. Though that's considerable, it's the texture. Buffalo hides are thick with a suede softness on one side and a glossy sheen on the other. In the cold, they stiffen a little, but warmth from a nearby fire makes them pliable again. You can see where they've been stitched with sinew thread, almost invisible seams turning multiple hides into a single vast sheet, something like a medieval patchwork quilt, except this quilt has the job of keeping your nose from freezing off. Here's the mainstream fact: a standard tipi cover might use 12 to 14 full buffalo hides, each carefully tanned and cut to interlock with its neighbours. That meant a family's survival literally rested on the backs of herds that once covered the plains like a moving sea. In fact, one tipi could represent a dozen successful hunts, hours of labour, scraping, tanning, softening and sewing. When you sit inside, later cosy and smug, remember it's the product of more work than most people spend assembling IKEA furniture. And here's the quirky tidbit: some hides were decorated before being sewn into the cover, painted with scenes of hunts, battles or dreams. Imagine falling asleep under a blanket where one panel shows your cousin's big hunting triumph, another your grandmother's star vision, and another a doodle you suspect was done by a bored 10-year-old. Scholars argue whether painted hides served primarily decorative or spiritual purposes, but either way they turned every tipi into a canvas gallery. Now you watch the process. A lifting pole already lashed to one edge of the cover rises slowly. People chant a little, partly rhythm, partly encouragement, because nothing keeps a group warm like pretending you're not about to wrench your shoulder out of place. The massive sheet arcs overhead like a sail catching an invisible wind, then unfurls across the frame. The sound is remarkable, a sudden deep rustle like a giant flipping the page of a leather-bound book. Edges are tugged, adjusted, and pulled taut. At the base, pegs and stakes are driven into the ground, anchoring the hides so that the lower edge presses tight against soil and snow. It creates a seal not perfect, but effective enough to keep the worst drafts out. And here's where the clever paradox appears. Sometimes families shove snow against the base, creating a bank that locks the cover in place and adds extra insulation. Snow, the very thing you curse for freezing your eyelashes, becomes the bodyguard keeping your warmth inside. The scholars chime in again here. Some argue this snowbanking technique was universal. Others insist it was situational, used only in particularly brutal storms. Written accounts differ. Explorers in one decade describe tipis practically half buried in snow, while others a few decades later remark on open skirts left for ventilation. Was it regional, seasonal family preference? You shrug because scholars may debate forever, but the family in front of you is already happily banking snow, and you can feel the difference as the wind outside softens to a hush. Once the hides are secured, smoke flaps at the top are adjusted. Two extensions like lazy ears can be pulled with poles or cords to angle against the wind. If you get it right, smoke rises smoothly into the night, leaving only a faint cedar tang behind. Get it wrong, and your teepee becomes a fumigation chamber, the kind where bedtime stories sound like wheezing coughs. One elder adjusts the flaps with the precision of a maestro tuning a violin, and instantly the air clears. You make a mental note never argue with a smoke flap master. Inside now the world changes. The light filters gold through hide walls, the wind is reduced to a polite background murmur, and you finally exhale. It's not hot, don't kid yourself, but it's survivable, which is sometimes better than hot. You notice how the hides breathe, letting just enough air through to prevent suffocation, but holding enough heat that the frost on your scarf starts to melt. And you notice sound changes too. Outside, the planes swallow noise, but inside, every whisper, every crackle of firewood, every dog snore is intimate, close, and oddly comforting. The hide walls are not just insulation, they're the canvas of family life, amplifying laughter, muting storms and catching shadows that dance like tiny plays on their surfaces. Of course, comfort is relative. You still have to tend the fire, shake out the robes, and guard against drafts. You still wake up occasionally to slap at smoke or retuck a flap. But compared to lying in the open, compared to a log cabin with icy gaps between planks, this feels like a secret handshake with survival. And here's the soft joke you think about modern tents, lightweight nylon marvels that fold into tiny bags. Would they keep you alive out here? Probably until the first bison sneezed in your direction. Then it's game over. But as you lie back, smelling smoke and hide, listening to wind and bells, you can't help wondering what about the fire itself. A friend, yes, but also a troublemaker. Too small and you shiver, too large and you roast, too smoky and you suffocate. How did families walk that razor's edge night after night? The answer flickers at the heart of the teepee, waiting to be told. You've just settled into the dim warmth of the hide walls when your eyes drift upward. There above the orange circle of firelight, the tipi's crown yawns like a sleepy mouth. Two flaps of hide, cut and stitched with deliberate care, dangle like half-closed eyelids. They are the smoke flaps, the unsung eyelids of the winter night, the difference between breathing and coughing, between comfort and chaos. You probably wouldn't think of eyelids as engineering marvels, but tonight, watching someone adjust them with a long pole, you realize these sleepy lids are what make the teepee truly habitable. The smoke flaps are deceptively simple. Two extra triangles of hide stitched to the crown, each with a stick or pole threaded through the seam, can be rotated or pulled by cords. In practice, this means a tipi could wink at the wind opening wider to draw smoke up or shutting down a draft when icy air barged in. The hides weren't just slapped on, they were cut with the angle of prevailing winds in mind, sewn so they could pivot like sails. And here's your mainstream fact: without those flaps, a fire indoors was unthinkable. A few minutes of smoke build-up would send everyone scuttling outside, coughing eyes watering and cursing the fire spirit. You hear the faint whoosh as a flap shifts. Outside, the wind catches it like a flag, and instantly the smoke curling toward the ceiling diverts upward and out. You feel the air lighten, the room breathe. The flap, you realize, is a conversation partner with the storm. Yes, wind, you may enter here. No snow, you may stay outside. And smoke you may leave politely through this door. Without it, the tipi would be just another suffocating hut. With it, it's a breathing living space. Here's the quirky tidbit: some accounts mention children being tasked with smoke duty. Imagine being 10 years old, armed with a pole taller than your house, and told to keep the family from choking on stew fumes. Too bored, too distracted. The next morning, everyone's complaining about your work ethic and worse, smelling like they've been marinated in hickory smoke. Some families solved the problem by assigning the flap adjustments to elders who could tell, almost by instinct, how a flap should lean in a given gust. Others turned it into a kind of unspoken contest, who could angle the flap so precisely that the smoke left in a thin unbroken ribbon as elegant as a calligrapher's stroke. Scholars naturally find something to argue about here. Did smoke flaps evolve independently among different nations, or did the idea spread through intertribal contact? Was there an optimal size-to-pole ratio? Some argue that a two-flap system offered more flexibility than single openings found in other indigenous dwellings, while others note that constant adjustments made it more labour-intensive. The debate remains unsolved, perhaps, because historians rarely have to live through a full blizzard in a smoke-filled tent to test their theories. The sensory anchors pile up as you sit back, the steady crack of firewood, the faint whine of wind squeezing past a flap, the rich scent of wood smoke. Every so often the flap moves again, letting a thread of cold air pour in. It's not unwelcome, you need a draught for the fire, but it comes with a sting that kisses your cheeks awake. You realise the flaps don't just manage smoke, they choreograph the very atmosphere. Warm air pools down low, cooler air brushes past your face, smoke escapes above. The tipi becomes a layered cake of climate zones, each bite different, none perfect, but together survivable. Here's the gentle sarcasm: if you think this sounds like an ancient version of smart home climate control, you're not wrong, except the app here is a teenager poking a stick at a flap. No push notifications, no thermostat, just a muttered, "Would you please tilt it the other way?" It isn't just about comfort either. The smoke vent was essential for ritual life. Fires inside tipis weren't merely practical, they were sacred, linking the household with the spiritual world. Smoke carried prayers upward, curling into the night sky, merging with the stars. So when someone adjusted the flaps, it wasn't only a matter of less smoke in my eyes, it was also ensuring prayers weren't trapped, smothered inside. That detail, overlooked by outsiders, explains why the smoke flaps were treated with such reverence. But of course, flap adjustment was never perfect. Some nights the wind swirled so hard that no matter how you angled them, smoke insisted on curling back down, thick and lazy, filling the teepee like a tavern the morning after. You cough your eyes water, and you wonder, why did anyone think this was better than freezing outside? Then you look at the glowing fire, the shadows of people telling stories, the hides holding back the gale, and you realise even smoky survival is survival. One more curious note: explorers sometimes misinterpreted these flaps as chimneys, assuming they functioned the way masonry chimneys did in Europe. But in truth, they were much more dynamic. Chimneys are fixed, rigid. Smoke flaps are alive, shifting, responsive. They turn the teepee into an instrument, one you play with wind and fire until the right note comfort is struck. As you lean back, lulled by fire crackles and flap sighs, you realise the teepee is never static. Its walls flex, its crown breathes, its flaps blink. You are inside something not just built but alive something, in conversation with every gust. And as your eyes close, you hear someone mutter, "Don't let the fire die." Because the flaps may breathe, but only fire makes them sing. But keeping that fire steady, that dance between warmth and danger, that's the next secret you'll have to learn. You edge closer to the circle, where heat begins the way a moth negotiates with a candle. Hopeful, cautious, pretending you're above the whole singe your eyebrow situation. The central fire is small tonight, more a disciplined glow than a bonfire, because that's how a winter tipi stays civilized. Big fires are flashy, sure, but they turn the roof into a chimney's worst nightmare, and your lungs into a smoke museum. A modest fire, carefully fed, makes the walls sigh instead of wheeze, and it warms you the way a good conversation does, steadily from the inside out. You kneel and feel it first in your hands, then in your cheeks, a tide of heat that moves in gentle waves. The ground is layered rush mats over earth, then robes and blankets radiating captured warmth back at you like friendly mirrors. Someone nudges a few coals with a willow stick, coaxing a hush of sparks upward. They drift like tiny winter stars, then vanish into the brown-gold canopy of hide and pole. You breathe in and get smoke, yes, but also resin, faint sage, and the savoury ghost of last night's stew. It's the scent of survival with a side of dinner. Here's the mainstream fact inside a well-run tipi: the fire is kept small and central, its footprint tight enough to cook over yet low enough to avoid licking the rafters. The goal isn't to roast the hide walls or repaint the ceiling with soot. It's to make a stable column of warm air a little weather system you manage with fuel-size spacing, and those blink-and-breathe smoke flaps above. Most families favoured split wood pieces the thickness of your wrist, big enough to hold a coal bed, small enough to adjust without drama. Think of it as the original dimmer switch, more sticks for a quick warm-up, fewer for a long quiet burn. You feed the fire with what the season allows. Along river bottoms, cottonwood willow and box elder are common guests. Out where trees are stingy, you add the famously misunderstood fuel-dried bison chips. They look unpromising nature's pancakes that nobody ordered, but they burn with a gentle even heat, and once dry they smoke less than you'd think. If you're wrinkling your nose, relax. Well-dried chips mostly smell like clean dusty grass when burning, not a barn argument. The surprise is how polite the flame becomes, no sparks trying to reenact fireworks, just a steady glow, as if the prairie itself decided to sit by the fire and behave. Now the quirky tidbit, some households kept a travel ember, a smouldering coal carried from place to place inside a lidded container, lined with punky wood or fungus or tucked in a bed of ash. That meant you didn't have to bully damp tinder on a bad day. You simply transplanted a living ember like a tiny glowing pet. It might ride in a horn cup, a clay pot, or even a carefully wrapped bundle. You babysat that ember like it was family because it was. If you've ever guarded a phone with 2% battery hunting for a charger, you understand the vibe. You notice how people sit around the circle. There's a choreography to it, elders closer to the heat, kids orbiting in and out like short-attention comets, dogs parking directly on the warmest patch as if they pay rent. Every so often, someone leans forward and tilts a stick, closing a gap so logs nestle instead of sulking apart. Firewood isn't dumped, it's placed. The difference is the line between cozy night and why is the smoke pointing at me specifically. Historians still argue whether winter fires were always dead center, or sometimes shifted slightly downwind to improve draw under certain flap settings. Some say placement varied with household habit, others insist practical aerodynamics ruled the ring. Archaeological ash circles don't always settle the question. A century of storms and trampling will move almost anything. You listen to the debate and smile because the evidence tonight is persuasive. The column rises straight enough that your eyes don't sting, and that's the kind of peer review you can trust. Fuel choices invite another argument. Did families rely primarily on timber from river corridors, or were bison chips the everyday staple beyond tree lines? The honest answer is that landscapes write menus. In wooded bends, split logs and kindling. Out on open prairie chips, brush whatever the wind hadn't already recruited. The genius isn't in picking one true way. It's in having 10 decent ways and choosing the one that won't make your evening a smoke festival. You tuck your hands near the coals and feel the stratified air. Near the floor it's warm and heavy, at chest height it's toasty, and up past your head it gets fussy, tugged toward the crown. Someone coughs once, a gentle reminder to adjust. A teen at flap duty tilts the pole and the smoke column tightens, a silk ribbon drawn toward the night. When it's right, you hear it. The tiny change in sound as the air begins to draft with purpose like a creek, finding its bed after scattering among stones. There's humour in the maintenance. You try to stack 2 logs that keep mysteriously rolling apart, which earns you a look, affectionate, exasperated, from an aunt who has been solving fire physics longer than you've been alive. She slides in a third piece, the stabilizer, and the whole structure settles with a pleased sigh. Triangles, she says, like a professor of warmth. You nod as if you knew that, mentally retitling yourself assistant to the regional fire. You set a pot to nudge the ember bed and hear the quietest hiss as last night's water wakes up. Steam ghosts upward, adding humidity to a room that would otherwise sand your throat like a winter desert. The steam softens, leather thongs calms, coughs turns breakable cold into bendable cool. When you lift the lid later, the cloud will paint the rafters with a soft glaze, a reminder that warmth isn't just temperature, it's kindness you can breathe. You think about modern heating for a second, the push-button ease, the way the warmth shows up without you lifting a stick, and you allow yourself a petty aside. Sure, central heat is nice, but it's hard to gather a family around a thermostat. Here the fire makes a centre and time keeps optional hours. Stories arrive, and with them the slow plummy cadence of night talk, how the horses fared, where tracks braided the snow, who dreamed of the bison road. You listen, and your shoulders drop an inch you didn't know you were holding up. Not everything is serene. A rogue spark jumps and 3 hands move at once, patting it quiet before it can audition for the role of disaster. You keep a lid, a scoop of snow and common sense within arm's reach. The hide walls are resilient, but overconfidence is flammable. There's a lively debate, half instruction, half legend, about whether certain woods spit more sparks than others. Cottonwood is the usual suspect. Willow pleads humble. The jury is eternal, but the courtroom is warm. When the fire sinks to a ruby bed, the room changes gear. Sleep shuffles to the front row. Someone pulls a robe closer. A dog executes a perfect nesting spin, and the draft thins to a cat's whisker. You nudge a last piece into place, not to blaze, just to keep the ember quilt stitched. Night is long. You plan for it in increments, like a baker tending a slow loaf. The rhythm is gentle, but real doze stir feed settle. Like working the graveyard shift, only the grave is outside and insists on snowdrifts. A final joke sneaks up on you. You realise you've been staring into the coals long enough to see a parade of animals, maps and faces, every ember, a tiny storyteller. The coals don't object being the night's television, but they do prefer you keep your show notes short and your kindling dry. You lean back, warmed spine to sternum, and forget how cold your nose was an hour ago. The tipi hums in its soft mechanical way, a muted wind around the skirt, a faint flutter at the crown, the occasional tinny rattle from a bell outside when a horse dreams of spring. The fire answers all of it with one language steady light, and you feel your breathing sink to the tiny pulse of the coals. Still, for all this comfort, there's a trick you haven't tried, one that turns the storm's own weapon into your ally, a little sleight of hand with winter itself. You glance toward the base of the wall where earth meets hide and see hands shaping something white and improbable into the perfect seal. But the way snow becomes insulation, the paradox that keeps the night gentle, that's the next duty, and it's stranger than it sounds. You crouch near the base of the wall where hide meets earth, and the night's big joke taps you on the shoulder. The thing trying to freeze you is also about to keep you warm. Snow in polite scoops and careful banks becomes the winter handyman, quiet, patient, and surprisingly good at sealing drafts. It's a bedtime paradox that feels almost magical the first time you see it, like asking the ocean to hush its own waves and actually hearing it listen. You watch gloved hands work the perimeter, packing drifts into a low, continuous berm. The sound is soft, and sandy snow squeaks in the cold grains, rubbing like tiny glass beads. Each handful is pressed, not pounded, because you're making a cushion, not a brick. A thin layer of powder is laid, then another and another, each one trapping air. That trapped air is the secret. Still air is a poor conductor of heat, which means your hard-won warmth prefers to linger instead of sprinting away. It's the same principle that makes a down quilt such a show-off, all those tiny pockets saying no rush heat, stick around a while. Here's the mainstream fact: snow, though frigid to the touch, is an excellent insulator because of its structure. Freshly fallen snow can be up to 95% air, and when you bank it against the teepee's skirt, it blocks wind, while creating a gentler transition between indoor and outdoor temperatures. The result isn't a sauna, no one promised a spa, but a calm edge where drafts lose their nerve. You can feel it immediately, the floor stops nipping at your ankles, and the fire's effort suddenly feels less like heroics, and more like daily maintenance. A small joke arrives as you help you try to sculpt an elegant continuous ridge, and accidentally make a lopsided snow croissant. Someone beside you chuckles and tidies the edge with 2 fast pats, the universal rhythm, for good enough to keep your toes alive. A dog trots over and adds the finishing touch, one firm stomp, then looks proud as if it just drafted blueprints. You thank the foreman and get a tail thump in return. The work isn't just about piling white stuff, it's about reading the wind. Downwind corners need extra attention, tiny gaps hide under the door flap's edges where a mischievous breeze loves to sneak in. You learn to spot problem spots by feeling with your wrist the skin. There is more sensitive a natural draft detector. Another method, an old winter trick, is to sprinkle a whisper of ash around the inside edge and watch where it stirs. No movement, no draft. A slight swirl. That's your invitation to plug a small leak with a handful of snow, a twist of grass, or a sliver of hide. It's home improvement at the speed of common sense. Here's the quirky tidbit some families made what they nicknamed snow snakes. Long-rolled tubes of packed powder that could be tucked along the lower seam, almost like draft stoppers you'd use under a modern door. Kids loved making them finally a chore with a cool name, and the snakes could be nudged or reshaped through the evening, as the wind changed its mind for the 15th time. When Thor threatened to turn a snake into a puddle, it became a household joke. Our snake shed its skin, someone would say, waving a mop. Outside, the night swells and settles like a slow-breathing ocean. Snowdrifts shoulder up to the hide, and the wall answers with a gentle inward hush, poles flexing, lines holding. Inside, the effect feels subtle then obvious. Your breath doesn't crystallize at the floor anymore. Your toes forgive you. The fire's voice drops a register. The frantic crackle eases into a confident purr as the draft stabilizes. You can even hear new sounds now that the hiss of wind is damped, a kettle's tiny tremolo, a beadwork needle softly ticking the horses outside, snorting in their own steam auras, like small volcanoes that know better than to erupt. Historians predictably argue about how universal snowbanking was, whether it was a routine winter habit or a storm tactic saved for the worst nights. Some explorer journals gush about tipis practically nested in white. Others describe open skirts to encourage fresh air and drier floors. Archaeological traces aren't much help. Snow leaves memories but not signatures. The best compromise may be the most obvious families did what the weather asked of them, and the weather never asked the same thing twice. In fierce windbank deeply, in milder spells loosen the seal for ventilation. Flexibility is the policy, not stubborn allegiance to a single method. The perimeter isn't the only trick. If snow drifts high enough, a small outer windbreak can be sculpted a few paces out a low crescent that convinces gusts to leap over rather than charge straight in. Think of it as coaxing wind to use the scenic route. The space between windbreak and wall becomes a calmer moat, where noise and air slow down a buffer zone that acts like a polite foyer shoes off volume down please. You notice how the ceremonial common sense scales. Near the doorway extra attention, near the rear gentler banks, and always exit paths kept clear. The last thing you want is to lock yourselves in with an overzealous snow fortress. Keeping a broom or branch near the flap is non-negotiable. One quick sweep can free a buried seam, or shake loose a powder lip before it decides to avalanche into your stew. Moisture management is the companion problem, and snow has opinions on that too. The more you seal, the more you must mind humidity from cooking and breath. That's why the flaps above still wink open and closed, why pots are positioned to steam gently, rather than gush, why wet mittens are hung high, where heat collects instead of draped low where they'll sulk and drip. You learn a new bedtime math. Every improvement at the base must be balanced by attentive breathing at the top. It's a duet edge and crown hush and exhale. By now, the motif of ocean keeps returning drafts or currents. Your banked snow makes a breakwater, and the tipi is a small warm boat moored in white water. You sit on your mat and feel the floor's temperament shift from brittle to bearable. Someone slides a reed mat to overlap a seam. Another tucks a robe corner down to graze the new snow ridge. Rooms are built, you realise, from little dovetails of care. Nothing here is accidental. It's all the craft of 1,000 evenings. And still not everything is solved by snow. If a sudden thaw arrives, the winter prank nobody laughs at your neat banks can slump into slush. Then the job becomes drainage, tipping a shallow channel outward, lifting the skirt slightly to breathe, trading a touch of draft for the mercy of dryness. Even then the lesson holds adjust then adjust again. A rigid house breaks. A living shelter bends and rethinks. You share a grin with the kid who made the best snow snake. It has an oddly dignified curve, and your mind wanders to modern weather-stripping foam rolls, hardware store solutions. Effective, sure, but none of them let you sculpt your own insulation out of the sky. There's a quiet wonder here, a feeling that the land is not just an opponent but a collaborator, temperamental, noisy, occasionally dramatic, but willing to help if you learn its language. One last pass around the circle, one last wrist check for sneaky drafts, and you step back to admire the invisible result. Not a fortress exactly, more a conversation with winter that ends in a truce. Inside, voices drop. The fire's purr deepens. You can almost count the layers hide, snow-still air quiet, like blankets laid one over another, until sound itself gets sleepy. You sit again, and let the new peace settle over your shoulders. Someone jokes that the snowbank is your assistant heater, unpaid but dependable. Another adds that it comes with generous benefits, silence, a gentler floor, and fewer complaints from toes. You try to complain anyway for sport, but the warmth at your ankles makes you a terrible liar. Before long, the night's next act begins. Steam lifts from a pot, making a soft ghost that curls toward the crown. The room fogs a little, the way glasses fog when you come in from the cold. You wipe an imaginary lens with the back of your hand and watch the world grow kindly out of blur. The snow holds the edges, the flaps warn the smoke, the fire keeps the centre honest. It's an elegant triangle of responsibilities, and you are finally not in a hurry. But there's a different sort of insulation waiting, one you can pull over your shoulders, layer by layer until even your dreams feel padded. It's heavier than you expect, softer than pride will admit, and it smells faintly of prairie and history. The buffalo robes are calling you by name, and the way they stack into a private weather system is a lesson all its own. You reach for the nearest buffalo robe and it's like lifting a small weather system. The weight settles across your forearms in a way that tells your brain, okay, we're going to be fine now. The hair slides beneath your gloves with a whispery rasp, almost like the sound of a distant drum rubbed, rather than struck. You spread the robe hair side down for the moment to keep snow off, and you feel warmth pool the way tea gathers at the centre of a cup. This is the plains' winter secret. People forget cozy isn't an accident. It's a construction. You build it in layers carefully like you're making lasagna, and the recipe's first instruction is collect a herd. Here's the mainstream fact: buffalo robes, soft-tanned bison hides left with the winter hair on, were the primary bedding and blanket material for many plains families, especially in the cold months. A winter robe from a well-fed animal could be thick, dense, and astonishingly warm. People wore them by day hair side inward to trap body heat, and slept under them at night, often in stacks. The thermal logic is simple enough to explain at bedtime: the hair traps air, the leather blocks drafts, and your body's shy heat finally works up the courage to stay. 1 good robe keeps a person comfortable. 2 feel luxurious. 3, and you start making oaths about never getting up again, ever, for any reason. An oath you'll break in 2 hours to feed the fire, but still. You watch the household turn the floor into a map of warmth zones. First reed or rush mats woven tight go down to lift you off the cold earth. Then a base layer of older, tougher hides, think of them as the crust. Above that, the buffalo robe's newer ones, fluffiest hair closest to your skin. Older, thinner ones pressed into service as top covers to trap rising heat. Someone chuckles and calls it stacking clouds. Someone else says lasagna, and now you're hungry and sleepy at the same time, which seems unfair. The robes themselves tell stories if you look closely. Some have faint smoke darkening along the edges from nights near the hearth. Others carry small stitched repairs where a rip flirted with becoming a draft. You run your palm along the grain and feel the difference between a calf hide's shyness and an old bull's deliberate heft. Hair length varies. Winter pelts are loftier, spring ones are sparser, and families learn to mix textures like a band blends instruments. Soft under sturdy over, and if the night is mean, a final windproof outer hide to press everything quiet. Here's the quirky tidbit: before sleep, a couple of smooth fist-sized stones are sometimes heated near the coals, wrapped in cloth or tucked into little skin pouches, and slipped under the robes at foot level. Instant foot oven. The stones doze there like tame suns, radiating a slow kindness you can wiggle your toes toward. If you've ever met a cold bed that made your soul consider hibernation, you will understand the joy of uncovering a secret warm rock shaped suspiciously like a potato. You may name your rock, no one will judge you. You help shake out a robe and learn the gentle art: no snapping, no dramatic flourishes, just an easy lift and ripple to free any frost. Then comes the brush. A bundle of stiff grasses, or a bone-toothed comb pulls out snow crumbs and freshens the nap so it lofts again. Women's hands move quick, practiced, restoring the robe's breath, and a soft, smoky vanilla of tanned hide rises as if the robe remembers the last summer prairie. If you listen, you can hear the hush-hush rhythm of brushing. Join the evening's other quiet music: a kettle's sigh, a dog's satisfied grunt, a tiny jingle from someone's work bag. It's the warm orchestra of small, useful noises. Scholars still argue about details you didn't realize could become conferences. Were hair-on robes always preferred for bedding, or did households sometimes line sleeping areas with hair-off hides for durability, and add hair-on as the topmost layer? Did tanning recipes, brain-tan smoke finish ash rub, create measurable differences in insulation, or just in feel and fragrance? How many robes would a typical winter household carry when travelling half a dozen more? The answers drift with time and place. Trade introduced wool blankets and cloth. Scarcity or abundance changed what typical meant. If you ask the elders here, they'll shrug and say what the weather always says back: it depends. The robe economy, too, is its own winter tale. Robes were wealth and wardrobe bedding and barter. On the open plains, they might be your best currency. Traders prized winter-taken robes for their plush hair, and that desire tugged at both family provisioning and intertribal exchange. A good robe could mean new kettles beads for ceremony, are better knife things that in turn made long nights easier. You hold one up and it's not only a blanket, it's a ledger of winter's work made soft. Sleeping arrangements have their choreography. Elders or infants claim the warmest spots. Parents flank toddlers like bookends that won't tip. Young cousins stage polite turf wars that end with everyone somehow warmer. Dogs, of course, operate on a bring-your-own-robe policy. They pat 3 times, turn twice and annex foot space with the solemn entitlement of royalty. You pretend you're taller than a dog's right to your ankles. The dog respectfully disagrees and files a successful occupation. Fair enough, your toes will thank the invader. You think about modern camping bags with their glossy promises of temperature ratings and zippers that don't quite cooperate at 3 a.m. A buffalo robe doesn't zip, but it drapes with gravity's perfect fit edges, overlapped so drafts can't find a handle. And it plays well with friends. One robe invites another, then accepts a third without the bunching chaos that nylon loves. Somewhere between robe 2 and robe 3, your spine releases a sigh of old burdens, and the cold skulks outside, annoyed that the bouncer won't let it past the door. A little care goes a long way. Hot embers and hair don't mix, so the nearest robe edge is kept an extra handspan back from the hearth ring. Children learn the rule quickly: hair to the heart, leather to the line. A pot tilts, and you leap only a splash, no harm, then the robe is brushed and lifted to steam dry its curls, springing back like it never happened. Robes are tough but not immortal, and a household's pride is in keeping them useful, long enough to become comfortable as memory. Another tiny trick: if the night gets sharp and you've run out of extra robes, someone will unroll a spare hide to act as a windlid across the foot of the sleeping pile, bridging person to person, so individual heat becomes communal. It feels like borrowing a little bit of your neighbour's summer. If you're family, you probably already share dreams. Sharing warmth is just the earlier chapter. By now scent has become its own blanket. A pleasant smoke perfume threads through everything oak if you had it willow, if that's what the river gave sage if someone smudged earlier. The robe carries it lightly, a hint that makes your eyelids heavier. You breathe and watch a bit of vapour drift from your lips, not frosty now, just a sigh you can see. In that tiny cloud is the whole physics of the night moisture heat, the exchange between your small fire and a very large sky. Humour sneaks in where comfort settles. Someone insists their robe weighs more than yours and therefore entitles them to an extra ladle of stew. Another claims they saw a constellation in the hair swirl, and it clearly means they get the warm rock. You counter that your robe has historical significance, which, to be fair, describes every object in the tipi. The court of laughter rules in favour of more stew for everyone, which seems like a precedent future courts should study. Outside, the wind reconsiders its plans and rakes a little snow along the skirt. The snowbank holds. Inside, the fire settles to a red murmur, a pulse you can match your breathing to. You lift the robe, hair side inward now, and discover the precise weight your ribs wanted. Warmth gathers in the cupped places, collarbone, hollow knee, bend the small cave where your hands meet. You test a turn, and the robe turns with you, a cooperative weather. Historians might tally robe counts, traders might calculate values. You in this moment measure success a simpler way: your feet stop complaining. Sleep arrives like a careful friend, not a storm's slow shore, considerate of your shoulders. You hear the nearest dog exhale into a snore that could be filed as a minor seismic event. The elder's voice is quiet to a comfortable susurrus. A bead rattles once in a pouch and then decides it's done with the day. And yet, even wrapped in fur and quiet, you notice the floor itself forgiving but not yet tender. Something still lies between you and true bone-deep ease, something woven by hands, that learned a river's patience, the layer that makes earth feel like a room rather than a road. Because after robes come the mats, and the way those woven floors turn cold ground into a gentle raft is its own small miracle waiting under your elbows to be told. You lie back for a moment, robes heavy over you, but your elbow brushes the floor, and you remember this isn't just dirt, it's a stage. Between the soil and your bones lies another invention, subtle but essential, the woven mats that separate human comfort from winter's blunt edge. They don't look like much at first glance, bundles of reeds, rushes, or cattails flattened and stitched, then unrolled into neat panels. Yet when you sit on them, the ground feels suddenly civilized. Hard earth becomes springy, frosty dirt becomes tolerable, and the tipi floor begins to whisper, "You may relax here." The mats start with the harvest. Picture a late summer bend in a river where reeds crowd in green armies. Families wade in, cutting the stalks while the water sloshes at their knees. Bundles are carried back, dried under the sun, and tied into rolls. Once dry, the reeds are split or flattened, then lashed with cordage made from rawhide sinew or twisted bark fibres. The finished mat isn't ornate, but it's steady, flexible and portable, rolled tight like a scroll, ready to travel with the rest of the household. It's a gift from wetlands to plains, one that endures storms in silence. Here's the mainstream fact: reed mats were used across many plains camps, not just as flooring, but as liners for walls and partitions inside tipis. They provided a basic layer of insulation, a way to keep dust and drafts down, and a slightly forgiving surface for sleeping. Laid across the ground, they made the soil less intrusive. Hung along walls, they softened echoes and kept condensation from dripping directly onto bedding. The result was a room that felt less like outside but with walls, and more like inside at last. The quirky tidbit is this mat sometimes doubled as quick gifts or barter items. If you arrived at a camp needing to prove goodwill, a neatly woven mat was like showing up at a potluck with fresh bread. Practical, polite, and sure to be appreciated. And because they could be rolled under an arm, they also became the first kind of luggage. You weren't just carrying bedding, you were carrying proof of care and craft. Imagine offering someone a mat today. It's the historical equivalent of lending them your best air mattress, except it doesn't squeak and deflate at 3 a.m. You notice how they're arranged now. A mat at the entry to wipe off snow. Another spanning the central hearth circle, preventing embers from burning directly into earth. Others stretched along the sleeping side overlapped, so seams don't line up. The seams are key, like shingles on a roof stagger them, and the cold finds no straight road inside. Someone smooths the edges, patting them like bread dough until they lie flat. Your knees appreciate the difference immediately. No sharp gravel pressing, no sudden chill leaping up your shins. There's also artistry in weaving. Some mats bear faint patterns, diamonds, zigzags, or rows of alternating reeds. Simple geometry made visible with colour differences. A child runs fingers along one, tracing the design, and you realise mats weren't merely utilitarian, they were aesthetic too, a way of giving plain space a heartbeat of beauty. Scholars debate whether decorative weaving was common across all groups, or whether it was a regional flourish. Some archaeologists point to charred impressions of patterned mats found in old campsites. Others argue those might simply be the accident of uneven drying. The debate hums on, but the mat under your knees hums louder. Comfort, comfort, comfort. Dogs unsurprisingly treat mats like their personal thrones. One circles twice and plops down with the sigh of an emperor finally satisfied with his empire. Children giggle as they test somersaults the mats, turning a dirt floor into a gym. You're reminded of a modern carpet, nothing dramatic, just a shift that says, this house has thought about your knees. You try to imagine sleeping directly on bare ground in winter, and your back shudders at the thought. With mats, it's not luxury, it's survival disguised as kindness. Maintenance is modest. If a mat grows too smoky or damp, it's hung up to dry by the fire edges curled like drying parchment. When it frays, someone weaves in a replacement strip, sometimes humorously, in a contrasting colour. You spot one such repair, a pale streak crossing a darker field, and it looks like a river meandering through a plain. You wonder whether it was intentional or just the world's sneaking art into practicality. You consider the rhythm of a night in here, fire in the centre, robes above, mats below. Each layer does its part. Without mats, robes would slide on dirt, moisture would creep up and toes would wake angry. Without mats, small objects would disappear into soil, and the tipi would never quite feel like a room. With mats, you sit straighter, laugh easier, and think this is a home, not a camp. The mats set the stage for the tipi's other actors to perform. And here's the gentle sarcasm: modern foam mats, inflatable pads, ergonomic sleep systems. They're nice, but do they double as door panels, sunshades and barter tokens? Probably not. Also, try explaining to your great-grandmother that your mat requires batteries. She'd shake her head and hand you reeds. You lean back now and notice the harmony robes holding warmth above mats, buffering cold below fire balancing in the middle. It's a sandwich of survival, each layer modest but irreplaceable. The floor no longer feels like a threat. It feels like a raft, a stable platform floating on the frozen sea outside. Your body settles and the tension in your spine agrees tonight at least you won't wrestle bare earth in your sleep. But as you close your eyes, you realise people don't just lie in heaps under robes and hope for the best. Families have their own geometry, their own ways of arranging bodies so warmth is shared and space is respected. The tipi floor is ready, the mats are spread, Now the puzzle of sleep begins head to foot, back to back. And the way families solve that puzzle, sometimes orderly, sometimes comedic, that's the next chapter of the night. The mats are spread, the robes are piled, the fire is breathing steadily, and yet the true art of warmth in a winter teepee hasn't even begun. Because all those layers, snowbank hide, wool reed, mats, buffalo robes, only get you halfway there. The other half is choreography, how you and your family arrange yourselves when the lamps dim, when the last piece of wood is nudged into coals, when the tipi shifts from a working room into a sleeping puzzle. You shuffle closer to the hearth, noting how people naturally migrate into position. There's no single diagram nailed to the wall. No one posts tonight's seating chart. Instead, it's learned by memory and muscle, refined by seasons and tested each time the wind howls. The principle is simple: warmth comes from proximity. But the execution, well, that's a nightly dance. Here's the mainstream fact. Plains families often slept in an orderly arrangement around the inside wall of the teepee backs against hides' feet, pointing toward the fire. Elders, infants, and those needing care were tucked into the warmest zones, usually downwind from the fire where drafts were weakest. Parents placed themselves as buffers beside small children. Younger or more agile adults took the edge spots ready to stoke coals, adjust flaps, or greet late-night visitors. Everyone's head lined roughly the same way, but feet angled toward the shared heat, making a rough circle. It wasn't a free-for-all, it was a plan. Now here's the quirky tidbit some families practiced head-to-foot sleeping rotations to maximize space and minimize accidental elbows to the nose. Picture a row of cousins alternating directions like sardines in a can, one head here, one head there, toes in opposite directions. It looked odd to outsiders, but it kept body heat distributed evenly, with fewer midnight complaints of "he rolled onto me again." Dogs naturally ignored these rules, curling into whichever crook seemed warmest, like living commas inserted mid-sentence. The sensory anchors add up as you picture it. The wind scrapes the hide wall like sand across parchment. The fire crackles softly, sending little waves of gold over the overlapping robes. A child fidgets, sighs, then finally releases a slow breath, and you can hear the exhale weave into the soundscape like another instrument. Somewhere a string of beads clinks once as someone shifts their shoulder. It's not silence, it's harmony, the gentle layering of noises that make the teepee feel alive even in rest. Scholars, of course, argue about the details of arrangement. Did families always line the walls? Or were there cases where bedding clustered closer to the fire, especially during extreme cold? Were mats divided into sleeping stations? Or did people claim spots by seniority? And habit archaeological evidence offers clues. Rings of fire ash suggest central hearths, while compacted soil along walls hints at repeated bedding zones. Some ethnographers describe a strict circle of sleep. Others note a more flexible approach. The debate, like the wind, changes direction, but everyone agrees on this: warmth was never random. Sleeping positions had symbolic weight too. For some nations, orientation toward cardinal directions mattered: east for beginnings, west for endings, north for reflection, south for vitality. In winter, practicality sometimes bent symbolism, but both layers existed. A child might be told, "We sleep this way so the dawn can find our faces," even while an adult muttered, "and also so you don't kick me in the ribs." Practicality and poetry shared the same bedroll. Now add humour, because bedtime in a tipi was never a solemn procession. Someone inevitably snored, prompting an elbow or a muffled joke. Dogs twitched in dream chases, occasionally kicking a human shin hard enough to earn a groggy. Really, babies fussed were rocked and fussed again, while elders told them half-asleep stories in voices so low they blended with the wind. One uncle claimed his spot by accidentally sprawling early, then defended it with theatrical sighs when asked to scoot. Bedtime politics were alive and well centuries before anyone argued about who got the blanket. The warmth came in layers of fabric, of body, of trust. If your cousin's elbow brushed your side, it wasn't an invasion. It was a reminder that you weren't alone in the cold. If your sister's feet pressed against your calves, it was heat you didn't have to negotiate with the fire for. The teepee became less a house and more a nest, each body a twig in the construction, each breath part of the insulation. Here's the gentle sarcasm modern sleep guides tell you about: optimal rest positions on your back, for spine alignment on your side for digestion. But they rarely include arranged 12 people, 3 dogs, and a pot of soup vapour in a circle. The plains version of a sleep study would have laughed at adjustable mattresses. The adjustment was always the person next to you shifting so everyone fit, At intervals, someone rose to feed the fire, padding across mats and stirring coals. They did it quietly, like a stagehand keeping the play alive while the actors slept. Sparks whispered upward, a flap creaked. The draft shifted, and the whole family unconsciously breathed deeper, pulled back into the lull. Warmth here was communal, not individual. The room's temperature depended on many small duties shared and remembered. Still, questions linger in your mind. What happened when a storm raged hardest? When the wind threatened to strip warmth from every surface? How did families adapt their positions, then closer, tighter, head to foot, more deliberately, or perhaps layered with extra robes overhead like a tent within a tent? You imagine that night everyone pressed so near the fire that even their dreams smelled of smoke. But storms weren't the only variable. Meals mattered too. What simmered in the pot during these nights added more than calories. It added steam aroma and sometimes comfort that kept spirits steadier than the fire alone could manage. Which brings you to the next piece of the puzzle. The stews, the boiling pots, the nightly cooking that doubled as both dinner and humidifier. Because in winter, what you ate wasn't just fuel. It was warmth you could taste and moisture you could breathe. You scoot a little closer to the hearth until your knees feel like they're on a private beach, and the pot in the centre starts talking to you. Soft syllables of simmer, a gentle tap-tap when a bubble kisses the lid and changes its mind. Winter on the plains can dry you into parchment, but tonight dinner doubles as weather. The steam that slips out and curls toward the crown does more than promise comfort. It stitches moisture back into the air, turning rasping throats into voices again. You breathe in, and your lungs nod. Yes, this is what a house should smell like. Smoke bone broth. A rumour of roasted corn and that savoury mystery note you can never name but always recognise. The pot is clever and humble all at once. Maybe it's an iron kettle brought by trade blackened to a shy shine. Maybe it's a thick ceramic vessel that has survived the jolts of a dozen journeys. Either way, it's heavy enough to mean business, warm enough to mean mercy. Someone, probably the most experienced cook who has no interest in debating temperature with amateurs, tilts the lid with a stick and releases a slow cloud that paints the rafters in ghosts. That cloud is more than scent. It's strategy. Dry air steals heat from bodies. Humid air lets warmth hang around like a guest who brought dessert. You drink the air with your nose and it drinks you back, gentling the edge of the cold that waits at the hide skirt. Here's the mainstream fact: winter stews weren't just about calories. They were hydration and humidifier in one steady pot. Across many plains communities, soups and stews built from dried meat. Pemmican jerky, bone-stored roots or squash corn, where it was part of the pantry, and foraged additions like wild onions or prairie turnip became the quiet engines of long nights. The bubbling surface released a slow river of vapour, softening the room and the people in it. In cold, dry air, your breath can scrape like sandpaper. With a simmering pot, it glides. Stirring as a choreography, you quickly learn, slide the ladle down the wall of the pot so you don't startle it. Skim a little fat and let it slick the top into a shiny quilt. Dip and turn from the shoulder, not the wrist, so you don't splash a robe. Around you, the sensory anchors multiply. The wind still prowls outside, but inside the ocean has arrived steamrolls and ebbs in waves, fogging the crown, then thinning when the flaps wink. Your cheeks dampen, your lips stop cracking, and your eyes quit rehearsing for the role of desert traveller lost in a library. Then comes the quirky tidbit: a clean fist-sized stone heated near the coals can be tucked into the stew to nudge a sluggish simmer without wrestling the fire. It's a little geology boost. Add rock, get patience. The stone settles with a plop, and a new constellation of tiny bubbles begins to rise like a pot learning to breathe again. Later, when the stone cools, someone will fish it out and place it back by the coals for its next gentle shift. Yes, you're essentially running a part-time spa for rocks. No, the rocks don't tip. If you're fortunate tonight, a bit of bone from a bison joint anchors the broth marrow, whispering its richness into the liquid. Maybe somebody drops in a scrap of chokecherry cake or a pinch of dried berries, or a twist of sage when the air needs a little unfurling. The room leans into it. Dogs drift closer with the stealth of seasoned professionals. Children perk up the way astronomers would if stars suddenly started handing out snacks. You sip too early and scorch your tongue, which is why someone presses a cool willow cup into your hand with the smile that says we've all been there. Historians naturally stir their own pot of debate. How often did winter stews feature corn on the northern plains? Which communities leaned more on pemmican versus fresh takes when hunting was good? At what point did iron kettles, enterprising traders, and the spread of horses change the nightly menu. Some insist the introduction of durable iron changed everything. The pot could sit closer to the flame, hold heat longer, and travel better. Others counter that technique mattered more than hardware stone boil methods with heated rocks in hide containers. Ceramic ingenuity and intensive knowledge of timing could match iron's performance. The truth as usual is a braided river channel's shifting context ruling. You accept the debate and take another careful sip, which answers the only question that matters right now. This stew works. The draft shifts when a teen at flap duty makes a neat adjustment. You watch the steam behave like a small weather map, a ribbon lifting straight to the crown when the wind cooperates, a swirl that loops once around the rafters when the breeze gets nosy. In a dry spell earlier, everyone's coughs were little gravel slides. Now conversation smooths. Someone tells a story about a hunter who followed breath trails in moonlight mist from a sleeping herd mapping the prairie like invisible ink. The pot answers with a hush of new bubbles as if it too likes that story. There's humour in the kitchen pit, obviously. You volunteer to stir and get promoted to assistant to the ladle, a title that comes with the great responsibility of not scraping the bottom like you're auditioning to play washboard in a band. When your elbow bumps the lid and rattles it, 3 heads look up in the synchronized glare known worldwide as "Please do not tilt the climate machine." You apologize to the climate machine. The climate machine forgives you with another ladle of comfort. Practicalities thread through the evening. Bones are saved, not wasted. Tomorrow's broth begins with tonight's leftovers. Grease renders into a small store of cooking fat sealed in a container that will make the next few days easier. If snowmelt is your water source, it gets warmed gently. First, pouring too much cold into a pot can startle the simmer into sulking. Ladles are rinsed with a mood of deliberation. Mats near the hearth get turned so any stray damp dries evenly. There's a rhythm to it that resembles prayer, many small attentions adding up to one greater kindness. You notice the etiquette that rides along with soup. The first servings drift toward elders, toward small hands, toward anyone whose cough sounds like a door that needs oil. Then the bowl circles like a slow comet. A dog gets a polite refusal. The dog registers a formal protest with its eyes. Someone offers a cube of meat to the protest committee anyway, deciding to pay the inevitable fine now rather than later. Steam halos hang under the crown. Beds breathe. The cold that had been aggressive earlier becomes merely ambitious, checked by roast broth and shared breath. And yet the balance can tip in a blink. Over-humidify, and you'll wake to damp edges and sullen mats. Under-humidify and noses crack and tempers follow. So the cook dials it by feel pot closer, pot, father lid, cocked a hair, or seated flat flaps coaxed to sip or exhale. It's a duet kitchen and sky with the drum of the fire keeping time. Outside, the night writes its own recipe, a pinch of sleet, a trace of hush, 2 scoops of distant coyote calls folded into the dark. Inside, you pour a second bowl, not greed, but science, and feel your hands forget the day's chores. Warmth migrates from tongue to chest to shoulders, persuading muscles to drop the last arguments they were saving for later. You think about modern humidifiers humming blue light into bedrooms, and you give them respect, but you also note they can't be ladled into your mitten. One more scholarly quarrel curls up by the fire was winter cooking, mostly open simmer, or did some families set the pot off the direct heat to steep like a giant tea, maximizing flavour and minimizing smoke? You watch tonight's answer play out after a lively boil. The pot steps back into the heat's penumbra, coasting while the crown blinks more open. The steam thins to a steady line, and the room stays balanced, enough moisture to soften, not enough to slick. Your throat, previously a fine grit sandbar, becomes a small lake. You promise your throat you'll be nicer to it in the morning. Your throat says it has heard that before. When the bowls are empty, the pot is not. It keeps its quiet vigil, a low cloud generator for the hours ahead. A ladle rests on a folded cloth the way a fisherman sets his net to dry. The lid leans back as if listening for refills. Someone tucks in the fire, someone banks the snow a hair higher, someone arranges a robe to capture escaping whispers of warmth. The house as a whole lets out a breath. It sounds like satisfaction. And just when your eyelids are ready to close for a tidy fade-out, the living soundtrack changes. 2 small figures appear in the half-light eyes, bright with the untired logic of youth. One carries a stick, not for poking the pot, we've discussed this, but for drawing patterns on the mat. A string of bone buttons clack softly. A tiny hoop rolls. A game that makes no noise except laughter is about to begin. Steam becomes fog. Fog becomes stage lights. The night smiles. Because as bellies warm and air softens, the tipi hosts another gentle weather system. Children's games that drift toward bedtime like small comets, losing speed play that warms without rattling the flaps, and somehow makes everyone sleep better after. But the rules of quiet games by firelight and the mischief they smuggle in with their manners that arrives next. The stew pot hums its lullaby, the mats cushion your elbows, and the buffalo robes make every inch of you feel like gravity has turned kindly. But the tipi isn't silent yet, not when children are still awake. For them, bedtime is a gentle slope, not a cliff. The games that unfold in this space are as much insulation as the hides outside. Play in winter keeps the cold at arm's length. You watch two small figures crouch near the firelight shadows stretching long across the reed mats, and realise the tipi has just changed gears. It's now both nursery and night stage. The games are quiet, not because anyone ordered them so, but because children know instinctively what the walls demand. Shouting would make smoke wobble, laughter too loud would feel strange inside the sacred hush. So their play is soft-footed, murmuring punctuated by giggles swallowed into sleeves. A stick drags patterns on a mat, spiral stars, maybe a buffalo hoofprint imagined. A bone button rolls clattering once, then spinning into silence. A small hoop and stick game unfolds, but in miniature. Instead of dashing outside, the hoop rolls in lazy arcs tapped gently so it doesn't crash into the fire. Here's the mainstream fact: children in Plains Tipis often played with toys made from what was at hand carved bone dolls, small drums, button and string games, or miniature bows. At night, these were adapted into quieter versions. Games served more than distraction. They were practice for adult skills. Even a hoop game echoed the chase of bison, the need to keep focus, the rhythm of persistence. Now the quirky tidbit one favourite bedtime toy was the buzz toy, a disc of bone or wood with two holes strung on sinew, and spun by pulling the cord. It whirred like a cicada, a low humming that seemed to blend with wind. In winter evenings that hum wasn't just entertainment, it was hypnotic, lulling children toward drowsiness. Some elders joked the buzz toy was the original white noise machine. Imagine drifting off with that steady hum replacing the sound of distant traffic. You smile because suddenly you'd rather have the cicada. The sensory anchors multiply as play continues. The wind presses faintly on the hide walls like a hand testing for weakness. The fire cracks and mutters. Steam still curls upward, leaving the crown glistening. Children's whispers add another texture, a weaving of human noise into the structure's fabric. Dogs raise their heads, occasionally curious, then sigh back into fur puddles. And over it all the tiny percussion of play button, rolling hoop, tapping, stick, scratching. It's bedtime jazz composed entirely for an audience of family. Historians unsurprisingly argue over details of childhood in the tipi. Were toys mostly made by parents or by the children themselves? Did girls and boys share games, or were they already practicing gendered roles through play? Some accounts suggest daughters learned sewing through miniature hide projects, while sons practiced hunting skills with tiny bows. Others argue the division wasn't so strict, children borrowed from each other freely, and the tipi's nightly games were simply whatever kept everyone occupied until sleep insisted. The evidence is murky, but the laughter is not. Tonight at least no one's policing toys. Games aren't just practice, they're medicine. On a long night when wind claws at the walls, children's laughter, even in small doses, acts like another blanket. Parents smile, elders nod, and for a moment everyone forgets that the world outside is 20 degrees colder than a freezer chest. You realise this is communal mental health disguised as buttons and hoops. A child makes a hoop wobble, dramatically pretends it's a drunk bison staggering, and everyone chuckles softly. The air warms. There's gentle sarcasm too. Someone mutters, "Better than your phone," pointing at the button game, and you laugh because if you gave a modern kid a button on a string, they'd probably call tech support. But here the toy works. Not because it's flashy, but because it's woven into the rhythm of the night. Slowly the games lose speed. The button is left on its cord, a hoop rests against a robe, and a stick falls from a hand. The children don't admit to fatigue. They insist the floor is just comfortable. One curls against a sibling's side, the other nestles by a dog, and suddenly the room grows quieter. Play didn't end abruptly, it melted. Like snow softening into water, the energy shifts from laughter to breathing. And yet as eyelids sink, another sound rises. A voice lower, steadier, practiced over hundreds of winters. Stories are beginning slipping into the night like a second fire. You realize bedtime here isn't a line, but a braid play, then story, then sleep. The games are over, but the legends are awake, and the way stories glow brighter than embers, carrying warmth through words that is the next secret of the winter tipi. The button game falls silent. The last giggle fades into the furs, and a new kind of warmth rises that has nothing to do with fire. It begins with the throat clearing a rhythmical sigh, and then words settle into the smoke like sparks that don't want to leave. Stories. This is the hour when the tipi turns into a theatre, when shadows on the walls aren't just fire tricks, but characters arriving to play their roles. The first voice you hear is steady low, carrying the weight of repetition. This story has been told 1,000 times, but the teller recites it like it's brand new. Children half asleep prick their ears anyway. Adults lean closer, not because they don't know the ending, but because knowing it is part of the pleasure. The tale curls into the air, layering itself with the smoke, with the sound of the wind fingering the hide walls. Here's the mainstream fact: oral storytelling was central to winter nights in Plains teepees. Long evenings, when hunting paused and storms penned everyone indoors, were opportunities for history, myth, and instruction to pass from generation to generation. Stories weren't distractions, they were archives, lessons wrapped in rhythm culture spoken alive. In this world, there were no written books to flip through. The tipi itself became the library, each elder a living volume. The quirky tidbit is this storytellers often use props or sound effects, turning simple objects into tools of imagination. A rattle shaken softly to mimic hooves, a handful of dry reeds crinkled to sound like fire chasing grass, even a dog's growl repurposed as the voice of a spirit in the tale. Children sometimes gasped or laughed at the cues, which was half the point, keeping them awake long enough to plant the story deeper. And naturally, storytellers weren't above adding jokes. The rabbit was so fast, one elder might say, that even your uncle here couldn't catch him. Everyone laughs, including the uncle who pretends to be asleep anyway. The sensory anchors are thick tonight. The wind outside has slowed, now sounding like distant surf rolling across a prairie sea. Inside, the fire is a bass note crackling steady beneath the words. Occasionally the smoke flaps stir, adding a sigh like a chorus line to the narrative. And then there's the storyteller's cadence, slow, drawn out, rising and falling like the lull of waves. You find your breathing syncing with the rhythm until you realize you're half in the story yourself, a character walking beside heroes whose footsteps you can almost hear on the mats. Scholars as expected debate. Were stories told only in winter, when darkness encouraged longer tales, or year-round as daily instruction? Were certain myths restricted to certain seasons, for example, trickster stories in winter? Only sacred origin tales reserved for ceremony ethnographers recorded different answers depending on time, tribe, and context. Some note that winter especially was seen as the season of stories when animals slept their tails could be told freely. Others point to accounts of summer stories told in shade proving exceptions abound. The truth you suspect is that storytelling was flexible, but winter was its favourite playground. What you notice most, though, is how stories warmed the room without raising the fire. The air thickens with shared memory. Children stop squirming, their eyes wide at first, now blink slower. Adults murmur responses at familiar beats like background singers confirming the chorus, and you realise this is insulation too. Not of hide, snow or mats, but of community. The tipi becomes unfreezable not because the temperature rises, but because the bonds do. There's gentle sarcasm from the storyteller too. In the old days, he says, pausing for effect, people listened with both ears. Nowadays he glances at a fidgeting teen, some listen with only one. The teen smiles sheepishly and everyone chuckles. It's a small joke, but it cuts the silence just enough to remind you that stories are alive, not museum pieces. As the tale winds on, you catch the shapes on the walls. The fire turns the elder's hands into giant puppets, shadows stretching to touch the crown. A wave of smoke makes them shimmer like spirits walking across hide. Children see them and smile in that dazed, dreamlike way that means they'll remember the image long after. For a moment you believe the shadows too. When the story ends, it doesn't stop. It tapers. The elder's voice trails into a low hum, then into silence, and the silence itself becomes the last line. No one rushes to speak. The pause is as much part of the story as the words. Then another voice, softer, picks up a new thread, maybe a trickster tale this time about coyote stealing fire, or maybe a family history about a migration. The tipi is patient. The night is long. There's room for more. And here's the scholarly debate again: how much were these stories entertainment and how much instruction? Some insist they were pedagogical first, with morals tucked like nuts in bread. Others argue they were community glue meant to soothe and amuse. Perhaps they were both, because what better way to teach than to lull someone into sleep with lessons disguised as jokes? The fire sighs low, the pot hums quieter, and the dogs twitch into deeper dreams. You catch your own lids drooping heavy from the voice, from the smoke, from the slow rock of cadence. Then the elder clears his throat one last time, leans in and says, "But stories can only carry you so far. Sometimes you needed something warmer at your feet than words." And you glance down surprised, because you hadn't noticed until now the dogs have curled close, their bodies radiating a warmth that no robe can match. The secret of living heaters with wagging tails is waiting in the next breath. You glance down, and there they are, the real furnace of the tipi dogs, curled into circles like commas in the night's long sentence. Their sides rise and fall in a rhythm older than words, each breath carrying heat that seeps into your toes before you can thank them. If buffalo robes are the blankets and snowbanks are the walls, dogs are the hot water bottles that bark. You stretch a little closer, and suddenly your ankles know comfort that even the fire couldn't deliver. It wasn't by accident. Across the northern plains, dogs weren't just companions or draft animals, they were part of the nighttime insulation strategy. A curled dog is a personal heater calibrated to exactly the right warmth. The thick winter coats of breeds suited to the prairies, shaggy double-furred, stubbornly snowproof, made them into four-legged quilts that insisted on sleeping where the warmth already gathered. You might think this was selfish, but when your feet stopped aching, you realized it was charity disguised as habit. Here's the mainstream fact: before horses were widespread on the plains, dogs were the primary domesticated animal. They pulled travois, carried small loads, warned of predators, and in winter nights lay at the foot of bedding piles. Their role in daily survival wasn't just functional, but deeply embedded in the rhythm of camp life. A tipi without dogs felt colder not just in temperature but in spirit. Now for the quirky tidbit, explorers and traders often remarked with surprise and sometimes envy at the way plains families used dogs as sleep aids. Some accounts describe children snuggling pups like living dolls, while adults strategically positioned larger dogs at the foot of the robes. One trader grumbled in his journal that his boots were stolen in the night by a camp dog who simply wanted them as an extra pillow. Warmth apparently was worth theft. You listen now, and the sensory anchors fill in the fire's crackle, a faint whimper from a dream-chasing hound, the steady percussion of paws twitching as they reenact hunts in their sleep. The wind claws at the hide walls, but the sound is muted now, because your focus is on the quiet pulse of warmth radiating up your legs. The smell of dog fur, earthy, smoky, slightly musky, mingles with the robe's scent of tanned hide and the stew's fading ghost. It isn't perfume, it's memory. It anchors the teepee as a lived space, not just a shelter. Historians, of course, argue about breeds and origins. Were these dogs descended from ancient Arctic types brought by early migrations across the Bering Land Bridge? Were they more closely related to modern huskies, or did they represent a distinct lineage lost to time? Some archaeologists have found dog burials alongside humans, suggesting companionship beyond mere utility. Others point to remains showing they were eaten in certain rituals, muddying the line between pet and provision. The scholarly debates continue, but on nights like this you imagine the families weren't thinking of taxonomy. They were thinking, "Thank you, small heater, for choosing my toes tonight." There's humour too, because dogs never sleep politely. One sprawls lengthwise, pushing a cousin's feet off the mat. Another snores so loudly it competes with the wind, leading to whispered jokes that maybe someone invited a bear inside. Puppies unable to commit to one spot crawl from robe to robe until finally collapsing in the middle, a tiny sun everyone orbits around. You try to move your foot and discover you've been pinned. Dog law decrees that once claimed space cannot be reclaimed. You sigh, but secretly your toes are grateful. The role of dogs wasn't only warmth. Their ears twitched at every sound outside hoof on snow owl wing, the crack of ice, and their low growls served as an extra layer of insulation, not against cold, but against surprise. The teepee was warmer not only in degrees, but in safety, because a dozen furry sentinels took turns patrolling dream borders while you slept. In modern terms, you might call it a 24/7 alarm system, with built-in heating. No subscription required, just food scraps and belly rubs. And here's where the scholars lean in again, was the practice of using dogs for warmth, universal across all plains nations. Or was it more prominent in certain groups? Evidence is scattered, accounts sometimes contradictory, but the motif is persistent. Dogs appear again and again in winter stories, in drawings in the corner of every hearth. The picture that emerges is clear enough: the cold was too much for pride. If you had a dog, you let it curl against you. You can't help but compare it to today. Modern campers sometimes bring their dogs into nylon tents, discovering the same truth. Poor warmed feet make nights survivable. The difference. Here it wasn't luxury, it was necessity. In the tipi, a dog's body heat could mean the margin between restless shivering sleep and restorative dreams. You stretch again, testing your luck, and the dog sighs heavier, warmer, as if to say, "Stop moving." This arrangement is optimal. You obey. The fire flickers. A child murmurs in half-sleep, "Don't let him hog the blanket." Someone chuckles. You smile in the dark, wrapped in the ridiculous practical grace of it all. And then a thought nudges you awake. If dogs kept watch and children drifted into dreams, what of the adults who moved between the night wasn't just sleep? It was a shifting schedule of quiet duties, small tasks carried out in the dark so the whole household could rest. Because once the fire dimmed, another rhythm began: the night watch of chores by firelight, repairs, beadwork, small labours that stretched patience until dawn. And those tasks, half lit and half dreamed, await you next. The tipi is quiet now in the way a ship at sea is quiet. Everything looks still, but a dozen small labours are keeping it afloat. Children and dogs are bundled in sleep. Elders recline under robes. The fire mutters low, yet some adults stay half awake. You realise winter nights are never entirely given to slumber. There's always someone on watch, someone's hands still busy. The chores are quieter than day work, yes, but they don't stop. They stretch themselves into the night like long threads, each one keeping the household stitched together until dawn. You sit up and see the first chore tending the fire. A hand reaches from the bedding, stirs the coals with a stick, then adds 2 slim logs. Not too big, no one wants smoke surging back down, but not too small either. Just enough to keep a red pulse alive. It's like adjusting a heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, never showy. The fire tender doesn't even fully wake. It's muscle memory, a movement learned across decades of storms. A quiet joke drifts through your head, the original night shift, without the clock or overtime pay, but with the same bleary eyes and the same resigned patience. Next comes beadwork. You hadn't expected this, but an aunt pulls a small pouch from under her bedding and begins threading with porcupine quills and tiny glass beads traded long ago. The fire's glow isn't much, but it's enough for fingers that know their patterns by feel. Each bead clicks faintly against the needle, a soft percussion under the fire's baseline. A strip of hide grows decorated in her lap colours, forming tiny constellations of design. You marvel in the dead of winter, at an hour when most of the world outside is simply trying not to freeze someone is making beauty. The night becomes not only survival but art. Here's the mainstream fact: Plains families often use nighttime hours, especially in winter, for quiet craft work. Beadwork, sewing, mending hides, braiding cord, or preparing sinew. These tasks required concentration, but not noise, making them ideal companions to the hush of a tipi. By morning, a new pair of moccasins might be half finished or a broken tool mended. In this way, the long winter wasn't wasted time, it was productive space. Now for the quirky tidbit: some beadworkers whispered that working at night when the world was dark and hushed gave their patterns stronger spiritual power. The stillness sharpened focus, and mistakes made in silence were said to invite dreams into the design. One elder supposedly remarked, "Night beads hold moonlight." It's a poetic claim, but as you watch the glint of blue glass catching the fire, you believe it a little. The sensory anchors deepen. The wind sighs against the snowbank muffled. The fire breathes in small crackles. The beads tick like raindrops. A bone awl scrapes hide with a rasp, soft as sandpaper on cloth. Even in silence, the tipi is busy. Every sound is tiny, but together they weave an audible fabric, thin but warm. Historians argue predictably about the extent of night work. Some ethnographers insist most labour was saved for daylight, with nights reserved primarily for sleep and storytelling. Others counter with accounts describing hours of nighttime sewing and craft, especially during long blizzards when daylight was scarce. Archaeological evidence shows wear patterns on tools consistent with long frequent use, but of course, it doesn't tell you whether those hours were in sun or firelight. So the debate continues. But watching this scene tonight, you suspect the truth is flexible. Sometimes whole families slept deeply. Other nights quiet industry carried them through. There are lighter tasks too. A man reaches for a bow, running his fingers along the sinew string, testing for slack. He pulls out a tool and tightens it with a practiced twist humming under his breath. Another person works on cordage, twisting strands of sinew into a braid, the rhythm steady and hypnotic. Every so often, someone checks the door flap, brushing snow aside with a branch, making sure no drift has crept in too far. Even in half sleep, the tipi breathes responsibility. You add humour because you can't help it. One sleepy cousin wakes, mutters something about, "I'll keep watch," then immediately falls back onto a robe and snores louder than the fire. Everyone laughs softly, no one scolds. After all, there are enough awake hands to carry the shift. Night is communal, no one is asked to be heroic. Small duties spread across many shoulders are lighter than one person's burden. And there's a scholarly debate tucked here as well. How did plains peoples divide these night chores? Was fire tending always one adult's role? Or did it rotate? Did beadwork belong primarily to women while men watched the flaps? Or were the tasks more flexible? The records are mixed, coloured by the assumptions of the observers who wrote them. But the living truth you suspect was practical. Whoever woke, whoever was restless, whoever's hands wanted something to do, those were the ones who worked. The hours slip like this. The chores aren't noisy, not dramatic. They're like whispers woven through the dark, bead here, twist there, stir now, check, flap, feed, fire. Every action is a stitch in the same quilt, keeping the night whole. The tipi becomes a loom, the family its threads, and the morning its woven cloth. You lean back and feel the atmosphere. You're not in a frozen prairie anymore, not in a room battling storms. You're in a bubble of patience, a cocoon where labour and rest coexist. It isn't exactly sleep, but it's restful in its own rhythm. The fire sighs, the beads click, the wind sulks outside, and you realise survival here isn't a loud victory. It's 1,000 small quiet tasks stacked until the night itself grows tired. And then in the middle of this calm, a new sound intrudes, a knock of hooves outside sharper than the wind, more insistent than snow. The dogs stir, ears pricked. The beadworker pauses mid-stitch. Everyone tilts their head. Because outside the horses are restless, stamping and snorting their bells, jangling in uneven rhythm. Something has unsettled them in the dark. And how you tend your animals even on nights like these is the next duty that can't be postponed. The beads fall still. The fire crackles on unaware, but the ears of every dog are suddenly at full attention, angled toward the door flap like compass needles finding north. Outside, hooves drum against the frozen ground, quick and sharp. A jangle of bells follows bright metallic, frantic in the way only a nervous horse can make them sound. Everyone inside the teepee knows warmth and craft may fill the room, but the night doesn't end at the hide wall. You rise carefully, pulling your robe tighter and edge toward the flap. The cold waits there like an impatient creditor. A hand lifts the cover just enough and a slice of a night air barges in. Your cheeks sting instantly. Outside the corral of horses is restless shapes shifting in the white gloom, steam clouds lifting from their nostrils. They stomp and shake their heads, bells clanging like alarm chimes. You squint into the darkness, but all you see are the ghosts of snow and the faint glitter of stars above. Here's the mainstream fact horses introduced by the Spanish in the 16th century, and spreading across the plains in the following centuries transformed every aspect of life from travel to hunting to shelter logistics. By the 18th and 19th centuries, they were central to many plains people's existence. But winter added another responsibility: horses had to be fed, watered and protected, even when blizzards made stepping outside a negotiation with danger. Keeping horses alive was keeping survival alive. A tipi might warm its humans, but the herd outside needed constant attention. You step into the snow boots crunching and feel the cold like knives sawing at your breath. The horses stamp again, their bodies glistening with frost manes stiff where snowflakes have welded themselves in. Someone follows with a bundle of dried grass and a skin bag of grain. The horses nicker softly when the food appears, anxiety melting into hunger. They press forward, hot muzzles shoving into your hands, breath-blooming clouds that smell sweet and grassy, strangely reassuring. Here's the quirky tidbit: in heavy snow families sometimes shoveled paths to make feeding easier, using snowshoes or branches to pack down drifts into firm trails. Horses could then move with less struggle and burn fewer calories in their fight against the cold. Some even wore crude snow boots of hide tied around their hooves to prevent ice buildup. To see such improvisations in the middle of a frozen prairie is to realize necessity invents faster than comfort. The sensory anchors multiply. The wind whistles like flutes sliding around the corral posts. The bells ring sharp and uneven, each toss of a head sending one note into the night. The horses breathe in chorus low huffs that rise like waves on an invisible beach. Your own breath joins them, harsh in your throat, caught between admiration and shivers. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes call high-pitched and mocking, and the horses flick their ears nervously. You feel their tension ripple through the herd like static electricity. Historians argue about horsekeeping methods in winter. Did families always tether them close within earshot of the tipis, or were they sometimes driven into sheltered valleys and left semi-free to forage? Some sources describe nightly checks, bells tied deliberately to forelocks so any disturbance would wake the camp. Others insist horses were sometimes trusted to wander short distances, their instincts guiding them back. The truth is likely situational, close during storms, freer in calmer weather. Tonight the bells prove their worth, an early warning system ringing before trouble could escalate. You smile faintly at the comparison that sneaks into your head. Bells on horses were the original smartphone notifications. Instead of pinging your pocket, they sang into the dark, "Something's wrong. Come look. Don't ignore me." Unlike your phone, though, a horse didn't let you hit snooze. The humour of the scene grows as the herd calms. One young gelding, still edgy, tries to nibble your sleeve, mistaking it for hay. Another sneezes explosively in your direction, covering your mittens with icy flecks that instantly freeze. You laugh quietly, because what else can you do? The dogs bark once from the doorway as if asking everything handled. You nod toward them, though they can't see your grin. Once fed and checked, the horses begin to settle. Their hooves pour the snow into hollows where they'll bed down muscles, relaxing into the rhythm of shared body heat. A few bells jingle more softly, a tired chime instead of a frantic alarm. You run your hand down one warm neck and feel the reassurance, strong, steady, alive. Out here, horses aren't just transportation, they're lifelines. Lose them in winter, and the road to spring gets 10 times longer. When you slip back inside the teepee, the contrast almost startles you. The air inside is damp and smoky. The fire sighs low and the hush wraps you instantly. Someone takes your mittens to dry them. Another hands you a ladle of stew. It's the reward for stepping into the storm. The teepee welcomes you back as if nothing outside was ever threatening. But your ears still carry the memory of bells and your skin still hums with the cold. The lesson is clear. Warmth isn't only inside walls, it's tied to the herd outside, to the animals that make tomorrow possible. And yet even when horses quiet, the night is rarely silent. Another rhythm stirs, music played not by bells or beads, but by human hands. Soft rattles, low drums, songs that rise like prayers into the smoke. Because when work is done and the fire holds steady, the night finds one last way to keep spirits from freezing: music, the steady heartbeat of community tapping through the dark. The horses have quieted their bells, reduced to the occasional tired chime, and the tipi is once again a cocoon of warmth and watchfulness. But the silence doesn't hold forever. Something softer stirs, not duty this time, but rhythm. A hand lifts a rattle seeds or pebbles, whispering inside. Another hand pats a drum, not loud, never sharp, just a pulse that seems to echo the human heart. Music has arrived, and in a winter, tipi music isn't entertainment. It's insulation of the spirit. You sit up straighter as the first rattle shakes the sound, like sand sliding in an hourglass. It sets the pace, a measured shh, as if brushing snow off the mats in time. Then the drum enters, flat, low, steady. Boom, boom, boom. Not the kind of boom that rattles your ribs, but the kind that invites your breath to match it. You inhale, exhale, and realize you're sinking without meaning to. That's the trick. Winter nights are long, and the mind can wander into frost if it's not warmed. Music ties the mind back to the circle. Here's the mainstream fact: drumming, singing, and the use of rattles were central elements of Plains lifeways, present not only in ceremony, but also in everyday life. Music was a tool for prayer, storytelling, and gathering courage, but it was also used to steady moods in the long night. A quiet drumbeat in the teepee wasn't necessarily a formal ritual. It might simply be a way to keep the camp awake in spirit when the world outside pressed too hard. Songs were often personal or familial, passed down like heirlooms, yet fluid enough to adapt to the moment. Now for the quirky tidbit: some winter songs doubled as sleep aids. There are accounts of mothers humming not lullabies but full ceremonial-style songs to calm children, substituting words with soft vowels until the melody became a hum. Scholars later debated, were these songs sacred or were they domestic improvisations? But for the family inside the teepee, the labels didn't matter. The effect was clear. Children yawned, dogs sighed, and soon even adults found their eyelids heavier. Music was melatonin delivered acoustically. The sensory anchors layer themselves around you. The fire provides a constant crackle. The rattle whispers like dried leaves shaken in a breeze. The drum keeps its bass heartbeat. Over this weave, voices begin low, breathy harmonizing in intervals that don't match Western chords but resolve beautifully anyway. Words float in and out, some you don't understand, some are fragments of stories already told tonight. The sound isn't polished, isn't rehearsed, it's lived. And the way it blends with the Tipis acoustics is eerie and soothing. Hide walls turn into a resonant drum themselves, the ceiling catching the sound and sending it back down in ripples. Historians predictably argue about the nature of these nighttime songs. Were they primarily practical tools to calm children, focus minds and accompany chores, or were they fragments of larger ceremonial repertoires adapted to informal settings? Some ethnographers recorded songs sung only in winter, tied to star myths and long nights. Others claim music was simply omnipresent too, woven into daily rhythm to be boxed into categories. The debate persists. But as you listen tonight, you understand the truth is layered. Music was both practical and spiritual, both bedtime and eternal. Humour slips in as it always does. A young drummer misses a beat and gets a smirk from an elder who teases, "That's not thunder, that's hiccups." Everyone chuckles, the rhythm resumes and the music continues richer for the joke. A child tries to sing along but yawns halfway, turning the word into nonsense. The rattle joins anyway, smoothing the gap. Music here isn't performance, it's participation. Even a mistake adds texture. There's another layer too, the connection to animals. Horses outside sometimes respond to the drum beat's ears, flicking hooves, shifting in unconscious rhythm. Dogs inside sigh and settle deeper when the rattle shakes like rain. The entire camp breathes together in music, not just the humans. You realize this isn't just sound, it's ecology. The prairie itself, sleeping under snow, hums along with the drum. You think of modern analogies and gentle sarcasm arrives. Spotify playlists for sleep you muse, but without the ads and the audio quality is impeccable. And unlike earbuds, this sound doesn't isolate, it binds. Everyone in the tipi hears the same notes, feels the same pulse, shares the same calm. The song drifts into a slower rhythm, now stretching, pausing. The drum is more space than sound. The rattle shakes once then rests. Voices taper. Silence folds itself back into the room, except now it isn't emptiness, it's resonance. The music lingers in bones even after it stops. You find your own breathing deeper, slower, as if you've been quietly trained to relax. Still, not every night's music ended with calm. Sometimes storm winds tested the walls and drumming grew louder in answer, a defiant beat against the blizzard. Other times, a sacred song might be sung, one reserved for a special moment. Tonight, though, it was gentleness chosen deliberately because what the tipi needed was rest, not battle. That decision itself was wisdom. The fire sinks lower, the beads are set aside, the rattles rest. The tipi has become nearly still again, except for the memory of rhythm that keeps everyone's heartbeat a little steadier. You close your eyes, but then notice something else. The storm outside shifts. It comes harder now, snow hammering the hide walls in bursts, hail rattling like 1,000 drums. The tipi shudders but holds. Inside you are warm, yet curiosity gnaws. What happens when a storm turns from background to main act? Because the blizzard is rising, and how the tipi defends itself against that pounding is the next lesson of survival. The drum has gone quiet, the rattles rest on the mats, and for a breath it seems the night might finally be content with calm. Then it happens. A new percussion begins, not from human hands, but from the sky itself. Snow slaps against the hide wall with a force that feels personal, as though winter has finally remembered your address and come knocking. Hail joins in hard pebbles, rattling like handfuls of beads hurled against stretched leather. The tipi groans, poles flexing, while the smoke flaps above snap like tired flags refusing to surrender. This isn't background weather anymore. This is the storm's performance. You lie still listening to the siege. The walls shudder but don't break. The snowbank you packed earlier earns its respect, now muffling the shriek of the wind at ground level. Inside, the air trembles but holds. Firelight flickers wildly, shadows lurch across the hides, turning calm deer into wolves, friendly dogs into giants. The family shifts under the robes, murmuring to one another, checking that everyone's still awake and accounted for. No one panics. They've seen storms like this before. But the awareness is sharp. You're inside a tent of hides and poles, not stone. The storm has teeth, and you can hear it testing the seams. Here's the mainstream fact: tipis were remarkably resilient in high winds and snowstorms designed with aerodynamics centuries before the word existed. Their conical shape allowed wind to slide around rather than catch and tear. Poles, flexible and numerous, shared the pressure, so no single rib bore the brunt. Snow sliding down the hides was expected, sometimes even desirable, because the extra weight pressed the structure tighter to the ground, making it more stable. What looked fragile to outsiders was in practice a storm-tested form honed by lifetimes of necessity. And now for the quirky tidbit: some families intentionally pitched their tipis with the door facing east, not only for ceremonial reasons, but because prevailing winter winds on the plains often came from the northwest. Facing east reduced the force, hammering directly into the flap. Explorers sometimes noted entire village circles aligned like compass needles, each door a tiny declaration: "We know where the wind lives." Tonight, the storm seems to confirm that wisdom gusts roar from the northwest, but the flap stays pressed shut, tucked beneath snow and hide, only trembling, never bursting. The sensory anchors sharpen under pressure. The wind outside is no longer a sigh, it's a scream rising and falling in banshee wails. Snow blasts like sand against the walls, abrasive, relentless. The fire flinches, smoke curling sideways before the flaps blink open just enough to let it out. You smell the sudden tang of burning resin as the flames fight harder, refusing to bow. The dogs growl low, not in fear but in alertness, every ear attuned to the shifting noises outside. Horses beyond the circle neigh sharply, their bells ringing wild alarms before settling into uneven clinks. The tipi feels less like a room now, and more like a ship rocking in a frozen ocean. Historians debate details as always. Were tipis purposely lowered, poles shortened, or covers tightened during the fiercest storms? Some accounts suggest families adjusted by bringing the hide skirt lower, pegging it deeper, effectively hunkering the structure down. Others argue the tipi's design was already optimal, needing little modification beyond banking snow and careful flap control. Archaeological evidence, ash circles, stake holes can't reveal storm strategies, so the argument remains a winter-long academic quarrel. You listen to the hides groan tonight and think, whatever the truth, the fact that you're not buried in snow right now is answer enough. Inside, the family adapts. Someone places another robe across the bedding pile, making a secondary ceiling to trap heat if the draft grows worse. Another tucks snow tighter against the north wall, braving the cold for a moment, coming back with frost on eyebrows but triumph in posture. The children are reassured with jokes. The storm just wants to dance on our roof. Laughter spreads thin but brave, and the sound itself feels like another wall against the wind. There's humour even in chaos. A sudden gust rips the flap open a finger's width, spraying fine snow across the floor. It lands squarely on a cousin's nose. He sneezes, then mutters, "Tell the storm I'm sleeping." Everyone chuckles, and for a moment the weather is just another mischievous relative crashing the tipi without an invitation. The scholarly debate stretches further. Some ethnographers claim storms like this led to temporary rituals, families singing certain songs to steady their courage or to remind the wind we're still here. Was this survival psychology, or was it faith? Perhaps both. Tonight, a low hum begins one elder's voice, barely louder than the fire, repeating a phrase until the children relax again. Whether it soothes by meaning or by rhythm, the effect is undeniable. The tipi steadies as much inside as out, and then as storms do, it shifts. The roar begins to ebb, replaced by heavy thuds of snow dropping in clumps. The wind grows tired, sulking instead of shouting. The tipi breathes easier. Everyone inside exhales in relief, shoulders lowering. You realize this is the rhythm of winter storms come, storms go, and the tipi bends but doesn't bow. You lean back, feeling the structure around you as alive as any creature, its poles flexing its hides, sighing, its snowbanks bracing. You think of modern houses with their rigid beams and glass panes. Strong, yes, but brittle. A tipi, by contrast, survives by yielding, by singing with the storm until it passes. And yet even with the storm quieting, the night isn't empty. The chores will resume, the dogs will settle, but some tasks require the darkest hours, fine work done only by firelight, quiet crafts that stitch patience into leather and bone. Because after storms comes stillness, and in that stillness hands keep working bead by bead, stitch by stitch. And those quiet midnight tasks, half dream and half labour, are what wait next. The storm has softened, now fading into the background like a drumline that lost interest mid-song. Snow still hisses down the hide walls, but the gale is gone, and inside the teepee you feel a deep stillness settle, the kind that seems to invite concentration. Most of the family exhales into sleep again, shoulders slack beneath robes, yet a few figures remain upright, lit by the emberglow hands, still moving eyes steady. It is the hour of quiet tasks, the work that doesn't wait for daylight. You lean closer and notice one of the women drawing a needle through hide the bone tip, flashing briefly each time the fire sparks. She's repairing a moccasin torn earlier in the day, the leather pliant from careful softening. The thread sinew taken from the back of a bison, split and stretched, fine slides through, with a sound like paper being folded. Stitch by stitch, the moccasin becomes whole again, and you marvel at the patience. To your drowsy mind, it looks like tedious labour, but to her it is ritual, a rhythm as soothing as a lullaby. Here's the mainstream fact: nights in winter were often used for maintenance work, sewing clothes, mending footwear, preparing sinew, twisting cord, or shaping small tools. The fire gave just enough light, and the teepee's quiet made concentration easier. Such labour was vital. Broken seams, weak cords, or cracked tools could mean misery on a hunting trip or disaster in a storm. Doing the work at night freed daylight hours for larger tasks like gathering wood, checking herds, or hunting. Now here's the quirky tidbit: quill work. The art of decorating hides with dyed porcupine quills was sometimes done in these hours. Imagine a narrow strip of hide stretched taut between two stakes, and fingers deftly flattening and weaving quills into patterns of diamonds and zigzags. Some accounts mention quills softened in the mouth before being flattened, and odd picture adults with a cheek full of porcupine needles like tobacco plugs. You chuckle to yourself, medieval multitasking but sharper. The results, though, were stunning geometric art, glowing even in firelight, proof that beauty was considered as necessary as warmth. The sensory anchors are strong in this hush. The fire no longer roars, but murmurs an occasional pop, sending sparks upward. A scraping sound repeats as a bone awl punches new holes in leather. The faint rustle of reeds as mats are adjusted joins the texture of sound. Even breathing has a rhythm now, children snoring lightly, dogs twitching in dreams, the adults at work inhaling sharply as they pull a stitch through. The teepee is alive with tiny noises like a forest at night, where nothing is still but nothing is loud. Scholars debate the division of these chores. Was beadwork strictly women's work, as many 19th century observers assumed, or did men, especially hunters, sometimes contribute to mending gear, repairing bows, or making cordage while their wives decorated garments? Some evidence points to fluidity. Necessity trumped categories. A torn snowshoe had to be fixed, and whoever was awake and skilled would do it. The neat lines scholars draw blur quickly when you're watching a storm repair session at midnight. You notice the humour too, because even quiet chores breed jokes. A woman sewing squints at her work and sighs, "I think my eyes have frozen." Her neighbour replies, "Good, then your stitches will stay straight." There's muffled laughter, careful not to wake the children. Someone else drops a bead into the rush matting, and the search that follows is silent, but dramatic fingers, sweeping eyes, rolling until the lost bead is triumphantly held up, greeted with a cheer quieter than a whisper. One man trims a bowstring, with his teeth spits out the loose fibre, and tests the tautness with a twang so soft it's barely audible. He nods satisfied, sets it aside. Another sits with a whetstone, slowly sharpening a blade, the stone hissing in rhythm. You realise that every small task here is insurance shoes that don't leak arrows, that don't snap blades, that don't fail. Survival isn't won in heroic bursts. It's built in these patient stitches and strokes. Here's another scholarly debate: did people work at night because they preferred the quiet, or because the long dark hours demanded it? Some accounts suggest families genuinely enjoyed these tasks by firelight making them social rather than burdensome. Others argue it was pure necessity, so much needed doing that night was simply overflow time. The truth, as usual, is probably both. Tonight you see smiles, you hear chuckles. The work seems less chore and more companionship. You shift your own position and realise the mats beneath you have been gently rearranged by someone keeping seams overlapped, smoothing wrinkles so drafts don't sneak through. It's work so minor you almost missed it, but its effect is real. Even comfort here is woven in increments. You imagine what your own life might feel like if every tedious invisible job, laundry, fixing a button, sweeping crumbs, was treated not as annoyance but as nightly ritual. You might even sleep better for it. Gentle sarcasm bubbles up again. Modern people complain about blue light from screens ruining sleep, but here's the secret bead light. A bead at midnight twinkling by firelight is enough to both exhaust and soothe you. No screen glare required, just the occasional mutter when a needle pricks a fingertip. As the hours pass, hands grow slower. The moccasin is stitched, the ball restrung, the beads tucked away. One by one the workers settle back under robes, the chores folded up with them. The tipi exhales again, full now not only of warmth, but of the satisfaction of work completed. Outside, the wind has almost given up brushing the hide walls like a broom instead of a battering ram. But just as you prepare to drift off yourself, the door flap stirs. A gust of colder air slips in, and with it a figure dusted in snow, shoulders hunched. It isn't a household member, it's someone from another lodge seeking shelter from the storm. Because in a tipi, warmth wasn't only shared with family. Strangers too could find a place by the fire when the night was cruel. And the duty of hospitality in the middle of a storm, warmer than any robe, comes next. The door flap stirs and the cold rides in like an uninvited guest who doesn't bother to wipe its feet. A figure follows, hunched against the snow shoulders, powdered white face streaked with frost. For a heartbeat, everyone inside the tipi stiffens, dogs bristle, a few hands reach for tools, but then recognition or simple instinct takes over. The newcomer is no threat. The real enemy is the weather clinging to his cloak. Someone leans forward, lifts the flap wider and ushers him in. Instantly, the night outside slams shut again, leaving only the echo of wind in your ears. The stranger stands awkwardly near the fire, melting in real time. Snow slides off his shoulders in wet clumps, steaming as it hits the mats. He blinks rapidly, adjusting from the white blindness of storm to the gold haze of firelight. Without a word, a robe is pulled from a bedding pile and draped around him. Someone pushes a wooden bowl into his hands, already brimming with stew. The rules are unwritten, but ironclad. No one is left outside on a night like this. Hospitality is as essential as hides or fire. Here's the mainstream fact among many plains nations: hospitality was not only custom but obligation. A visitor, whether kin, ally or stranger, was welcomed into the lodge, fed and given a place to rest. Refusing shelter in winter could be as deadly as refusing water in summer. Survival wasn't just individual. It was communal, reinforced through generosity that ensured reciprocity. The camp was stronger when no one froze alone. Now the quirky tidbit there are historical accounts of travellers who arrived at tipi unannounced, expecting at least a warm corner, and sometimes leaving with gifts, food, clothing, even horses. To outsiders, this generosity looked astonishing. But to the families inside, it was insurance. Today you give, tomorrow you may receive. One anthropologist even noted that to enter a tipi and not be offered food was considered shocking, almost a breach of morality. Imagine if modern neighbours treated unexpected guests the same way. Ring the bell, and you're handed stew and a blanket before you can even explain yourself. The sensory anchors make the scene vivid. The stranger's boots drip onto mats, hissing softly near the fire. His breath, ragged at first, soon joins the rhythm of the household's breathing, slower, steadier. The robe's smell, smoke-tanned hide, faint musk, wraps him like an old friend. Dogs circle, sniff, then settle, accepting him as part of the circle now. Outside, the storm still scratches at the walls, but inside, warmth multiplies by one. Historians debate the boundaries of such hospitality. Was everyone treated equally, or did status matter? Some sources claim leaders' tipis offered more elaborate welcomes with richer food and finer furs, while others suggest even the humblest household shared what they had. The truth likely varied, generosity scaled to resources, but the ethic of welcome remained constant. Hospitality wasn't optional, it was identity. There's humour too, because even kindness comes with jokes. Someone mutters, "We've got another log for the fire now," pointing at the dripping snow melting from the guest's shoulders. Laughter rolls through the tipi, gentle but warming. The guest smiles sheepishly, shrinking a little into the robe as if to say, "Yes, I'll dry quietly." Another quips, "Don't sit too close, you'll flood the stew." The children giggle, and the tension melts faster than the snow. You can't help but compare it to modern times. Imagine knocking on a stranger's door during a snowstorm hoping for food and a bed. In most cities you'd get suspicion, maybe a lecture about boundaries. Here the answer is immediate: come in, sit, eat. It's survival disguised as generosity, or maybe generosity disguised as survival. Either way it works. The stranger finally speaks, a voice hoarse. He had been caught between camps when the storm rose too fast. His horse is tethered nearby, half buried in snow but safe. He had thought he might not make it, but the glow of this tipi saved him. Heads nod sympathetic but not surprised. Everyone has their own storm stories. Tonight his joins the collection. Here's another scholarly note many explorers misunderstood Plains hospitality, assuming it was transactional gifts traded for future favours. But deeper records suggest it was spiritual as much as practical, tied to values of kinship that extended beyond blood. To deny someone warmth was to weaken the whole web. The tipi wasn't just a home, it was a node in a network of survival. The fire pops and the guest flinches unused to the sudden noise. Someone hands him a heated stone wrapped in cloth, sets it in his lap. He exhales deeply, shoulders slumping, finally safe. The children half asleep peer at him with curiosity, then tuck themselves back into their robes. Within minutes, he's one more shape among many another breath in the rhythm of the room. And here's the gentle sarcasm you think of modern phrases like crash on my couch. But in the teepee there is no couch, no spare room. There's only one shared bed of robes, mats and firelight. The idea of personal space doesn't exist in the same way. Instead, warmth itself is communal. Everyone pressed a little closer, everyone's elbows a little tighter. It works and no one apologises for it. As the storm outside lulls again, the tipi exhales with the new guest included. The circle has grown, but the warmth has grown with it. Hospitality has added not just one more body, but one more layer of comfort, of resilience. And yet, even as peace settles, the next challenge lurks. The fire is lower, coals dimmer, and the long night isn't finished. Because the question that never rests is this: who will rise next to feed the fire, and how do you keep it alive until dawn? The teepee has grown quiet again, the stranger folded into its warmth as though he had always belonged. Dogs lie curled at the door, children's breathing is steady, and even the storm outside seems content to pour at the walls without fury. But the fire, always the fickle heartbeat of the night, has begun to sag. Its glow is dimmer now, coals spread thin like the embers of an argument that won't quite reignite. If warmth is a currency, you're nearly broke. Someone will have to rise to leave the warm cradle of robes and strike the bargain again with wood and flame. This duty is universal and universally resented. No one leaps up joyfully to feed a fire at 3 a.m. It's always a reluctant shuffle, a grumble, a robe dragged half on half off. Tonight the honour falls to a man near the hearth, who groans theatrically, then sits up like a reluctant bear leaving hibernation. His breath puffs into the cool air, visible even inside proof that the fire is fading too far. With stiff fingers he pokes the coals, coaxing them into a glowing cluster. Sparks leap upward like fireflies startled awake. Here's the mainstream fact: maintaining the fire through the night was a rotating responsibility. Some families assigned it formerly elders, teenagers, or whoever had drawn the lot that week. Others relied on whoever woke naturally restless or thirsty to tend it. Letting the fire die wasn't just inconvenient, it could be dangerous. Restarting it in a storm meant fumbling with flint or ember, wasting precious time and tinder. More importantly, the tipi's delicate balance of warmth and ventilation relied on a living flame. No fire meant no heat, no cooking, no spirit light. Now for the quirky tidbit: there are accounts of families deliberately banking the fire under ash before sleep, smothering it just enough to let it smoulder slowly like a sleeping dragon. Come midnight, a quick stir and a breath would wake the coals again, ready to flare with minimal effort. In effect, the fire itself napped, and the humans were merely its babysitters. One traveller even noted a child assigned the task, bragging that he could wake the fire faster than his uncle. You imagine the scene: a proud 8-year-old blowing into the coals until they glowed, cheeks puffed hair, standing in the static, grinning like he had just saved the world. The sensory anchors return in layers as the man tends the hearth. The scrape of wood against coals, the soft hiss, as sap flares the sudden rush of flame climbing a log. Shadows surge again, racing up the poles, sending dancers leaping across the hide walls. The air shifts from cool to warm in a single breath, so fast you feel the frost melting off your nose hairs. And then the smell returns too, rich smoke, resin, the faint sweetness of half-charred wood. Warmth comes not in silence, but in a full sensory orchestra. Scholars argue naturally about how fires were managed long-term. Did families rely primarily on wood gathered daily, or was bison dung still an important fuel source, even with horses making wood gathering easier? Some journals describe households carrying glowing coals from camp to camp in horn or clay containers. Others suggest sparks were struck anew each morning with flint. The evidence is uneven, but the theme is consistent. The fire was never truly allowed to die if it could be helped. A living flame was worth more than all the kindling in the world. Humour slips in as it always does. The man who stirred the coals sneezes as smoke curls into his face, prompting a muffled laugh from someone still half asleep under robes. "Good job you've smoked the soup again," they tease. He waves his hand dramatically, pretending to direct smoke like a maestro conducting a stubborn orchestra. The fire obliges by straightening into a clean column at last. "See," he mutters, "perfect technique." Nobody believes him, but everyone appreciates the warmth. There's also etiquette in fire tending. Too much noise and you wake the household unnecessarily. Too little effort and you risk everyone waking from cold an hour later. The task requires balance, a kind of midnight diplomacy. You wonder if this was the ancient origin of middle management, not glamorous, not heroic, but necessary to keep everyone else comfortable. And then comes the rhythm again, wood placed carefully angled to lean on one another, creating triangles that won't roll apart. Ashes brushed gently aside, revealing a red core like a hidden gem. Sparks encouraged with a steady breath, until they flare brighter. The act is so deliberate it feels ceremonial, even if it's done with half-shut eyes. The dogs stir and reposition, sighing as warmth returns to their paws. A child half awake murmurs, "Thank you," without opening her eyes. The man smiles faintly, pride sneaking past his grumbling. He settles back into his robes, fire steady, now glow restored. The tipi exhales, relieved as though the structure itself was waiting for reassurance. But your mind lingers on a question. What if the fire couldn't be saved? What if, despite ash banking and careful tending, the coals went cold in the middle of a storm? Because hidden in the night's calm is the contingency plan, the knowledge of how to coax flame from nothing, to steal sparks from a stone, or to borrow a coal from a neighbour's lodge. And the ancient rituals of rekindling, half practical, half sacred, are the next secret you're about to learn. The fire burns steady now, but your thoughts won't let it rest. You wonder what if those coals had gone dark, buried too deep under ash, or smothered by clumsy hands. What if the ember bed had been nothing but grey dust when you reached for it? The answer isn't simply make a new fire, not in the middle of a blizzard with tinder-damp fingers stiff and horses stomping impatiently outside. Starting a fire from nothing was its own kind of ordeal, part skill, part patience, and some would argue part prayer. You picture it, the hearth gone cold, the family stirring unhappily under robes, someone muttering about smoke flaps, someone else groaning about stiff toes. Then a figure rising, resigned, reaching for the fire-starting kit tucked carefully away. A small leather pouch, worn shiny at the edges, holding the entire promise of light. Inside, a shard of flint, a piece of steel, or in earlier times, pyrite or iron-rich stone. A pouch of dry tinder, perhaps shredded bark, finely fluffed grass, or the papery innards of a milkweed pod. Sometimes even powdered buffalo dung so dry it would catch the faintest spark. Here's the mainstream fact: traditional fire starting often relied on striking sparks onto tinder, using flint and steel once steel became available through trade. Before that, percussion with iron pyrite or the slow friction of fire drills were employed. The skill required wasn't trivial. Sparks had to land in tinder fine as hair, coaxed with careful breath until they glowed. A single misstep, too much air, not enough, snuffed the ember, forcing the process to begin again. That's why most households preferred never to let a fire go out. It wasn't impossible to rekindle, but it was work best avoided. And here's the quirky tidbit: some families carried travel embers. A coal carefully nursed in a container of punky wood fungus, or even a horn, could smoulder for hours, even days if fed properly. Travellers moved from lodge to lodge with their own pocket-sized sunlighting fires anew without ever striking stone. One elder supposedly joked, "You can lose your way, but don't lose your ember. It complains louder than your wife." You grin in the firelight. The humour has a ring of truth. The sensory anchors are vivid in your mind. The sharp clink of flint on steel, the hiss of sparks showering onto dry grass, the faint tick of tinder catching glowing like an insect's eye. Then the breath, slow, deliberate, steady, pushing that glow wider until smoke unfurls. It smells dry, acrid, hopeful. And when the first flame curls upward, tiny and stubborn, it crackles like applause. That moment isn't just relief, it's triumph. In the middle of a prairie winter, conjuring flame feels like magic. Scholars argue about which method was most common in which era. Did plains peoples adopt flint and steel immediately when Europeans introduced it? Or did older methods persist side by side? Archaeological finds show both charred tinder bundles and percussion stones, but context is hazy. Some ethnographers describe fire drills, 2 sticks, 1 spinning in a hearthboard, while others claim such methods were rare on the open plains, where tinder choices made sparks more efficient. The debate still flickers much like the coals themselves. You watch in imagination as someone in the tipi kneels to coax the flame. Children peek from under robes wide-eyed, holding their breath as if their silence might help. Dogs shift, sensing the strange rhythm. Finally smoke thickens, a tongue of flame licks upward, and the room sighs. Relief washes over everyone. The fire is back. The tipi exhales alive again. Humour sneaks in, of course. Someone quips, "I told you to feed it before bed," casting mock blame at the previous fire tender. Another adds, "Next time we'll ask the dogs they breathe warmer. Even in hardship, laughter oils the gears." You realise the act of rekindling wasn't just practical, it was communal reassurance. Watching someone summon flame from nothing reminded everyone that survival was still within reach. The spiritual layer lingers too. Fire wasn't just heat. It was life messenger presence. Smoke carried prayers upward. Flame gave stories their glow. Some traditions treated the rekindling of fire as a small ceremony in itself, with quiet word-spoken offerings of sage or fat dropped into the first flames. To outsiders, this might look like superstition. But you sit here tonight and feel the difference. The fire isn't just utility, it's relationship. You don't restart it like a machine. You greet it like a guest returned. And you realise that even with a rekindled fire, the battle with cold doesn't end. The hours drag on the wind, prowls the coals need tending again. Winter nights on the plains are long marathons, not sprints. Comfort is won in increments, each ember a mile marker. Yet dawn does exist. Somewhere beyond the hides, the eastern horizon will eventually pale. And when it does, the night's long trial gives way to new rituals, the welcome of morning, when smoke turns golden, and the teepee begins to stir into life again. But until the first hint of dawn arrives, one more challenge waits how to rest in shifts, sharing the long watch of the cold, without letting anyone drift too far into danger. The fire glows steady again, but the night stretches on like a road that refuses to end. Sleep wants to claim everyone, yet someone always has to remain half awake. This is the rhythm of winter shifts of rest, invisible handovers of duty, a relay race run in silence. You roll onto your side, watching how it works. One adult's eyes close while another's flutter open, not quite willingly, but enough to keep the circle unbroken. It isn't an official roster written on bark or hide. It's instinct, a rotation built from necessity. The first stirrer is the man who just rekindled the fire. He shifts back into his robes, sighing like a log settling in ash, and within minutes his snores rejoin the night orchestra. But across from him, a woman sits up, hair tumbling down, rubbing her face. She pulls the robe tighter around her shoulders and looks toward the coals. She isn't exactly cheerful, nobody is at this hour, but her eyes are clear enough. She is the next watch. Here's the mainstream fact: plains households often practiced informal shift sleeping during winter nights. Not everyone was awake at once, but someone was always near alertness enough to tend fire, check the door flap, or calm restless animals. In larger lodges, 2 or 3 adults might take turns. In smaller families, wakefulness simply rotated, each person rising when their body stirred. It wasn't military guard duty, it was organic. Still, the result was the same: no teepee was ever fully asleep. Now for the quirky tidbit, some communities use dogs as unofficial night shifters. A dog's growl or bark often replaced a human's vigilance, rousing the lodge at the first sign of trouble. People half joked that the dog keeps the first watch, and then after enough barking, the humans take the second. There are accounts of children being teased awake with, "It's your turn, go be the dog now." You imagine a sulky 8-year-old crawling toward the fire, muttering like a miniature guard. The sensory anchors deepen in this hush. The fire's crackle is steady, a small heartbeat. Wind sighs against the snowbank, gentler now, like an old man muttering instead of shouting. The door flap rustles occasionally, but the woman checks it with a quick hand, tightening it against drafts. The air smells faintly of charred wood and robe fur, with just a trace of stew still clinging in the air. You hear the stranger who joined earlier breathing deeply, his relief so heavy it sounds like gratitude itself. Historians predictably debate whether this shift system was conscious or accidental. Some argue it was deliberate, families understood the need and planned accordingly. Others suggest it was merely the natural result of crowded sleeping. So many people in one space, someone was always awake by chance. The truth likely falls in between practicality woven into habit mistaken for coincidence. Tonight, though, you see the pattern clearly. The tipi survives because sleep is staggered, not simultaneous. There's humour too, because even in vigilance, people find ways to tease. A boy wakes, briefly sits up and declares dramatically, "I'll take the watch," then promptly collapses face first into a robe and begins snoring again. His sister whispers, "Best guard we've ever had." Stifled chuckles ripple through the dark. Laughter, even whispered, carries warmth almost as real as the fire's glow. You think of modern equivalents, security cameras, smoke detectors, alarms humming on walls. Here the alarm is your cousin's elbow nudging you awake or the sound of a log shifting in the hearth. The system works, but it's intimate, human-sized. There's no outsourcing, no electronics. Survival is a family project renewed every hour. The woman on watch adjusts her robe, adds a log to the fire with a careful hand, then sits quietly staring into the flames. Her face flickers with the orange light, and you wonder what she's thinking. Maybe she's replaying the story told earlier, or worrying about tomorrow's hunt, or simply tracing shapes in the coals. Night watch is half duty, half meditation. The quiet is so deep it pushes thoughts forward, and perhaps that's why some claim these hours were best for prayer. And here's another scholarly note in some accounts. Prayers or songs were whispered during night watch small offerings to keep the family safe. A low chant, barely louder than breath, would rise with the smoke directed not at the sleeping family, but at the spirits who stayed awake longer than any human. The line between shift duty and ceremony blurred easily. Maybe that's why the hours passed bearably. They weren't just about fire and flaps, but about speaking to the unseen. As you drift yourself, eyelids heavy, the pattern continues. One sleeper wakes, another dozes, logs are added, snow is checked. The tipi becomes a living organism, breathing in shifts, its consciousness never fully extinguished. It's a rhythm you realise modern households have lost, replaced by the illusion of total rest behind locked doors. But here rest is communal, stitched together by staggered wakefulness. And then just as dreams start to claim you, you notice something subtle. The darkness outside has changed. It isn't lighter yet, but it isn't as absolute. The black has thinned, softened as though a new layer has been painted over it. Someone on watch notices too, whispering east is waking. Because beyond the snowbanks, dawn is preparing its first brushstrokes. And the rituals of greeting morning smoke rising into pale light, the lodge stirring to life, are the next chapter you're about to witness. The watch has stretched into something timeless, but now the dark itself begins to loosen. It's not light yet. Not really more the absence of full black, a softening at the edges of the hide walls. The storm has gone to sulk elsewhere, leaving behind a stillness so complete that even the wind sounds sleepy. Someone on watch leans toward the door, lifts the flap an inch and nods. The horizon is shifting. East is awake. The change is subtle, almost unnoticeable unless you've sat through enough long nights to recognize it. The stars are dimmer not because clouds cover them, but because dawn is brushing them away. The snow outside reflects that faint shift, glowing just enough that the ground looks like it's been powdered with ash instead of ink. Inside the teepee, the fire suddenly seems brighter, its orange competing with the creeping grey of morning. Here's the mainstream fact: mornings in the teepee were marked not by clocks but by light. As soon as the eastern glow touched the horizon, daily rhythms began. The fire, which had been survival through the night, became the starting bell for chores. Women often rose first, rekindling flames into full cooking fires, while men prepared for hunting, wood gathering or horse care. The lodge itself transformed from sleeping chamber to bustling household within minutes. And here's the quirky tidbit: in some plains communities, dawn wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Prayers were often offered at first light smoke directed eastward as a greeting to the new day. Some accounts describe individuals stepping outside, even in brutal cold, to face the horizon and speak quietly to the rising sun. One elder reportedly said, "If you don't greet the dawn, it may not greet you tomorrow." You shiver at the thought, not just from the chill, but from the weight of that worldview. The sensory anchors now weave daybreak into the teepee. The fire snaps a little more confidently as though encouraged by the light. The air smells sharper, cleaner morning air creeping in through seams. You hear the first stirrings, a child rolling over, grumbling, then burrowing back into robes. A dog shaking itself vigorously, collar bells jingling like an impatient breakfast bell. A horse outside nickering softly its call, carrying through the snow-hushed air. It's as if the whole camp is yawning at once. Historians argue about how structured morning rituals were. Some records emphasize dawn prayers and ceremonial greetings, while others suggest families dove straight into chores saving ritual for more formal occasions. Archaeological evidence can't tell you what someone whispered to the horizon, but ethnographers captured both versions dawn as holy dawn, as routine. Tonight you've seen how both could be true. The line between sacred and ordinary was as thin as the edge of the fire's smoke. Inside, robes are folded, mats brush snow shaken from coverings. Someone stretches a rush mat to dry near the fire. Another checks a pot stirs the remnants of last night's stew into something that smells suspiciously like breakfast. There's no snooze button here, the sun is rising whether you like it or not. One cousin mutters, "I just went to sleep," and another teases, "Then you had the best watch." Laughter bubbles softly enough to wake the children who grumble louder than before. There's humour in the chores too. A young boy yawning so hard his jaw clicks, volunteers to fetch wood only to fall back into his robes before reaching the door. His sister crows. The log carried him instead. Dogs bark as if agreeing. The rhythm of work is already threaded with comedy softening the edge of morning's demands. The fire is fed again, logs hissing as frost melts from their bark. Smoke rises confidently, now curling into the tipi's crown, before slipping out the flaps where dawn's light turns it pale gold. For a moment you watch smoke and sunlight mingle, the breath of earth and the breath of sky weaving together above your head. You can't help but think this is what continuity looks like. A night endured, a day begun, a rhythm older than history. Gentle sarcasm returns in modern life. We groan about alarms, brew coffee like it's a survival potion, and insist we're not morning people. Here, morning is unavoidable. No one debates it. The horses need feeding. The fire needs wood. The children need food. Dawn isn't an enemy, it's an employer, and your shift just started. As the tipi stirs, fully awake, you realize something profound. The night was survived, not through one grand gesture, but through hundreds of small attentions, banked snow, tended fire, layered robes, stories, songs, dogs, chores, shifts. Each act was ordinary, but together they made the extraordinary possible, a family alive to see another day. And yet, even as the daylight creeps stronger, you sense that the night leaves behind its own archaeology ashes, footprints in snow, faint impressions in mats. Long after, historians will dig into these traces, trying to reconstruct how warmth was crafted against storms. Because the story of the night isn't just in memory, it's written in the silent rings of ash left behind. And those remnants, puzzling and debated, are where the scholars pick up the trail. Dawn stretches thin, gold fingers across the horizon, and inside the tipi the fire burns brighter. No longer a desperate ember, but a companion with renewed confidence. People stir, fold robes, shake mats and prepare for the day's tasks. Yet even as the living move into motion, the remains of the night remain. Ash, charcoal, faint rings of soot around the hearth. To you they look like yesterday's mess. To future eyes, archaeologists, historians, curious wanderers, they are a script, a record of survival, written not in ink but in smoke and residue. You crouch closer to the fire pit, brushing your fingers across the ash. It's soft, powdery, almost silky, with flecks of black charcoal hidden inside. There's heat still faint and fading enough to warm your skin for a second before vanishing. This is the record of the night, the visible memory of how a family fought back the cold. You realize every tipi that ever stood left behind these circles, quiet evidence of a rhythm that might otherwise vanish. Here's the mainstream fact: archaeological excavations across the plains often reveal circular ash deposits where tipis once stood. These hearth circles are among the most persistent traces of nomadic life, surviving long after hides, poles and mats have decayed. They tell researchers where fires were built, how large households might have been, and how often sites were reused. Ash rings mark human presence as surely as stone foundations mark villages elsewhere. And here's the quirky tidbit: ash wasn't only debris. Families sometimes reused it as insulation, sprinkling it around fire pits to control drafts, or scattering it outside the tipi to reduce slipperiness on icy ground. In some traditions, ash carried symbolic meaning, too mixed into paint dusted in ritual, or used to mask scents from predators. Far from waste, it was another resource. Some elders even teased children by marking them with a dab of ash on the nose, calling it winter's kiss. The sensory anchors still cling to the ash. The smell of smoke lingers earthy and rich, reminding you of every crackle and pop from the night before. When stirred, the ash sighs upward in a pale ghost cloud, drifting toward the flaps like reluctant spirits. Your fingertips come away grey-smudged proof that the fire lived and laboured here. You imagine entire campsites covered with these traces, each ash ring a fossilised heartbeat. Historians and archaeologists argue naturally about interpretation. Were hearths always central exactly beneath the tipi's crown, or were they sometimes offset? Did variations reflect cultural differences or simply adjustments to wind and weather? Some scholars point to clustered ash pits suggesting multiple households shared tasks. Others argue that overlapping rings are evidence of camps revisited across seasons. The truth remains debated, sifted through soil samples and carbon dating. But what is certain is this ash is history's most humble diary, keeping stories without words. There's humour too in how people treated these remains. One child given the task of cleaning the hearth smears ash across his cheeks like war paint and declares himself Smoke Chief. His siblings laugh until they cough, then join in, soon looking like a tiny squad of grey-faced warriors. Adults shake their heads, but the laughter lingers. Even ash, the leftover of warmth, finds ways to warm the spirit. The practical side is unavoidable. Before new wood can be added for breakfast stew, the ash bed is cleared or shifted. A shallow pit is scooped, embers gathered carefully to one side. Someone carries a handful of cooled ash outside, scattering it into snow, where it instantly darkens and melts a small crater. You notice how even disposal becomes rhythm scoop scatter reset. The tipi breathes by clearing its lungs. And here's another scholarly wrinkle: ash deposits have revealed diet clues to researchers. Mixed within the grey powder are sometimes charred seeds, bone fragments, or bits of shell. These remnants whisper of meals, corn-roasted marrow, boiled berries stewed. From ash archaeologists piece together menus of centuries past. You can almost hear the debates. This seed proves agriculture. No, it's wild forage. The arguments rise like smoke themselves, circling endlessly, refusing to vanish. The contrast between your modern mind and this ancient record strikes you with gentle sarcasm. You think of your own trash plastic cans wrappers and how archaeologists of the future will puzzle over them. Compared to that, ash feels dignified, even poetic. At least it turns back to earth quietly instead of haunting landfills for centuries. As the family moves around you, the ash circle is refreshed. A few glowing coals remain tucked like jewels in the dust. They'll be the seed of today's fire coaxed again into flame. Children scatter the last of last night's grey outside, watching it melt snow in patterns like delicate lace. Dogs sniff the powder, curiously sneeze and trot away. Life continues, but the ash remains as evidence today's footprint, tomorrow's fossil. And as you look at the circle, you realise it's more than memory. It's continuity. Every night leaves its ring, every morning its scatter. And when families move on, the ash remains a silent note left for the earth to read. But ashes aren't the only trace of the night. Outside, the snow still bears imprints, hooves, paw prints, boot tracks, and the long drags of sleds. The ground is a storybook, and dawn's first light reveals its pages. Because in morning's pale glow, the snow itself becomes archive, recording every movement, every duty of the long night gone by. The fire is awake, robes are being folded, the ash pit is tidied, and for a moment you think the night's record is finished. But when you step outside into the pale dawn, you realise there's another archive waiting, etched not in soot but in snow. The storm that raged hours ago has left a soft canvas across the camp, and every step, every paw, every hoofprint has signed its name upon it. The ground is now a storybook, and morning light makes the ink legible. The first thing you notice are the horses' prints clustered and restless near the corral. Hooves dug deep, scattering frost in crescents, telling of their unease during the storm. Bells still dangle from their manes, faintly clinking as they shake the last clumps of snow from their coats. Each print is sharp, frozen in relief like clay pressed with a stamp. Even without words you can read the story, panic pacing, then calm, all recorded overnight. Closer to the lodge, smaller tracks crisscross the drifts. Dogs, ever restless, had patrolled around the tipi, their paw prints layered over each other, until they became a pattern like stars in snow. One trail veers toward the woodpile, another loops behind the lodge as though a curious nose had been hunting phantom scents. The prints led back to the flat proof that warmth was always just steps away. You smile, dogs leave more records than historians could ever catalogue, and everyone says the same thing. We were here. We were working too. Here's the mainstream fact: snow acted as both obstacle and ally in winter camp life. It insulated lodges, but it also recorded movement. For archaeologists and historians, frozen or compacted snow layers, can preserve impressions that later freeze into the soil, beneath leaving traces visible long after. For families, these prints were immediate evidence telling them where animals had wandered, whether predators had prowled, or if someone had been moving around in the night. And here's the quirky tidbit: children often turn the snow into their own sketchbook. They stamped patterns, spirals, zigzags, stick figure hunters chasing stick figure buffalo. They rolled small balls into tracks, then claimed they had trapped snow spirits. Some elders encouraged it, teaching lessons in tracking by pointing out differences. See how the hare leaves 2 prints ahead, 2 behind. See how the fox's trail is straight, never wandering. Learn the snow, and you'll learn the prairie. So the snow became both toy and textbook, playful and practical at once. The sensory anchors are sharp in this pale light. The air smells new, crisp metallic, carrying a faint tang of pine from wood smoke rising across the camp. Your boots crunch through crusted snow, each step popping like cracking sugar. Horses snort breath, steaming into halos. Somewhere in the distance a raven croaks its wings, brushing the stillness. The snow itself sparkles, reflecting light so fiercely it feels alive, as though dawn has scattered diamonds across the prairie. Historians argue about how much tracking knowledge was passed casually to children versus formally taught. Some ethnographers insist every child grew up learning to read snow prints the way others learned to read letters. Others suggest it was gradual, a skill absorbed through play and observation. The evidence, oral accounts, written journals, faint, fossilized tracks suggest both. In truth, snow was never just weather. It was a surface for memory, a record keeper available every winter morning. Humour sneaks in too. One boy proudly points at a cluster of prints and declares, "Wolf." His sister rolls her eyes. "That's our dog, silly." The boy insists, crafting a dramatic tale of wolves circling the teepee while everyone slept. The adults chuckle, letting the children argue, because even in error there's learning. And laughter, of course, is its own insulation against the morning cold. As you walk further, you see human tracks too. The arcs to the horses, the quick dashes to the snowbank, the steady trails to wood piles. Each path is a sentence in the story of the night. Some overlap, some cross, but together they form a map of survival. You realize the ground remembers what people forget. While you slept, the snow was the scribe, and it kept faithful notes. And here's the gentle sarcasm you think of modern GPS trackers. Fitbits logging every step, apps recording sleep movement. Here the snow does the same, silently, cheaply, without charging overnight. Your every shuffle is memorialized until the next storm erases it. Privacy? Forget it. The snow knows. As the sun climbs higher, the tracks soften edges, blurring. By midday they'll be gone, buried under new drifts or melted by weak sunlight. The archive is temporary, fleeting. But that's the rhythm every day, a new record every night, a fresh inscription. To live on the plains is to write in snow, knowing the page will always be turned by weather. You step back into the teepee, cheeks tingling, and realize something: both ash and snow have kept the memory of the night. One black, one white, both fragile, both eloquent. But inside, another kind of record endures too, not in ash or snow, but in words. The elders' stories, the songs, the whispered prayers at dawn. These are the records that outlast storms passed mouth to mouth, ear to ear, memory to memory. Because the last and strongest defense against the cold wasn't hide snowbanks or even fire. It was a knowledge, the shared understanding of how to live, how to endure, how to laugh. And the passing on of that knowledge through story and song is the final warmth of the winter tipi. The sun has now edged higher, pale and reluctant, spilling just enough light through the flap to remind you that the night is truly over. The storm's roar is memory. The horses are calmer, the dogs are stretching, the children are grumbling their way into wakefulness. Yet the tipi still holds the hush of the night before the long chain of labours that brought everyone to this dawn intact. You sit cross-legged, robe draped around your shoulders, and realise the final warmth that kept the household alive wasn't ash or snow or even fire. It was knowledge passed down, repeated, retold, until survival became second nature. The elder seated by the hearth clears his throat, his face lined by firelight and mourning both. He begins to speak not with the grandeur of last night's myths, but with the quiet cadence of instruction. His voice is low, patient, meant more for the children wriggling under robes than for you, though you find yourself leaning in anyway. He speaks of how to bank snow against the tipi wall, how to listen to the horses' bells, how to angle the smoke flaps so the wind obeys. Each line is a lesson disguised as casual advice, and each child soaks it in even as they pretend to yawn. Here's the mainstream fact oral tradition: was not only for myths and legends, it carried practical survival knowledge too. Instructions on shelter building, fire tending, food storage, and storm behaviour were embedded in stories, songs, and sayings. In cultures without written language, memory was the library and repetition was the lock that kept its doors secure. What you hear now is not a speech, but an inheritance, a chain of wisdom that ensured one family's survival linked to the next. Now here's the quirky tidbit: some lessons were taught in riddles or jokes, making them easier to remember. A child might be told, if the smoke curls left, the storm will not, or teased, don't let the dog sleep on your toes unless you want frostbite on your nose. These sayings weren't scientifically precise, but they stuck. Generations remembered them because they were funny, rhythmic, and easy to repeat by the fire. You realise modern mnemonics, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, aren't so different. Survival has always liked a good punchline. The sensory anchors swell as the elder continues. His words mingle with the last pops of the fire, the faint crack of ice shifting outside the rustle of mats as people fold them for the day. Smoke drifts upward in a steady ribbon, no longer desperate, no casual, rising to greet the pale blue sky beyond the flaps. You smell leather warming, stew reheating, and the earthy tang of hides rubbed with snow to keep them supple. It's a tapestry of scents and sounds woven together by voice. Scholars debate, of course, about how structured this passing of knowledge was. Some ethnographers claim winter nights were formal classrooms, children drilled in rules of survival. Others argue it was looser lessons emerging organically in stories and jokes. Archaeological records, inevitably silent, can't answer whether a hearthside lecture was school or just family life. But tonight, having listened yourself, you sense it was both. Lessons seeped into children's bones, not through rigid teaching, but through the rhythm of daily survival reinforced every storm, every morning. The humour doesn't disappear. As the elder talks about proper flap angles, one child interrupts. But what if the smoke just doesn't listen? The tipi erupts in chuckles, even the elder smiling as he replies. Then you whisper to it kindly, and if that fails, you send your uncle to argue with it. The children giggle and the memory lodges deeper. Lessons wrapped in laughter travel farther. You sit back and realise that this rhythm of storytelling, joking, remembering is the strongest insulation of all. Fire dies, snow melts, hides wear thin, but knowledge endures, moving forward in mouths and ears. Every survival trick you've witnessed, dogs for warmth, mats for insulation, stew for humidity, fire flaps for breath, exists not because of one clever moment, but because countless winters trained people to repeat them until they became instinct. The tipi is not just wood and hide, it is memory stretched into shape. Gentle sarcasm sneaks into your thoughts. Modern people Google how to survive in winter camping after a single night in the cold. Here, survival tips are built into bedtime jokes and morning rituals. No Wi-Fi required. The archive isn't digital, it's human. The elder finishes his talk and silence rests for a beat. Then children scatter into chores, adults rise to meet the day, and the tipi transitions once more from shelter of the night into engine of the morning. But you remain seated, letting the realization sink in, so the most important blanket you carried through the storm wasn't buffalo hide or snow wall. It was knowledge shared and remembered, making every other defense possible. Outside, the prairie glitters, wind still nipping, but sunlight stubbornly pushing through. The tracks in the snow already blur the storm, already fading into story. But inside, the memory of the night will linger, in every smudge of ash, every wrinkle of mat, every word spoken by the fire. The long trial is over. Morning has arrived, and the tipi patient, flexible, enduring, has once again proved that survival isn't about defying the cold, but about knowing how to bend with it. The day has come, though faint and pale, and the long night in the tipi has passed into memory. You've seen fire coaxed from coals mats, woven into warmth, dogs curled into living blankets, and horses singing their alarms into the dark. You've heard the songs, the jokes, the whispered lessons, each one a stitch in the great quilt of survival. And now, as the morning unfolds, you're invited to loosen your own grip on wakefulness. Imagine yourself sinking back into the robes, the fire reduced to a steady hum, smoke spiralling gently upward like a slow ribbon. The air is softer now, no storm rattling the walls, only the faint sigh of wind and the occasional shuffle of snow slipping from the hide. The tipi is quieter with each passing moment, children's laughter fading as they tumble outside, adults murmuring as they step into the light. The lodge itself exhales, leaving behind only stillness, only the comfort of endurance. You picture the prairie stretching far and white, the horizon endless, the sky rinsed with a fragile blue. But here inside you are safe, wrapped in memory as much as in hide. The rhythm of the night stories, chores, songs, fire echoes softly, but not to keep you awake. It's a rhythm designed to let your thoughts slow your breath, even your body release its tension. Let the images linger, the flicker of embers, the warmth of dogs at your feet, the hush of a storm finally spent. Let yourself drift with them gently, the way smoke drifts toward the crown. The tipi has carried you through, and now it carries you toward rest.